Yeah.
All right,
Hello.
good to see you, Larry.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast. We host Larry Liu, and so I'm joined again by Michael Lachanski, and thank you for being here, taking the time. It's been a great pleasure. Also, the pre-conversation was very good. And so yeah, you were to jump right into it. You were interested in work, precarious work, job instability, which of course is a phenomenon that impacts a lot of American workers and also in a lot of countries in the world. Yeah, the floor is yours, I guess. Right?
All right, sure. So I'll talk about all the papers that I've written. I have written or I'm in the process of writing on this. And basically, I have five projects. And then one of them I actually can't describe because it's under embargo by the Russell Sage Foundation. They have a very tight, media and advertisement operation, and they're very, very um, kind of they have their own way of doing things and they have their own peer reviewers and their own like professors and evaluation system. So I can't talk about that process till it's over, but I can talk about the other four papers. And this set of projects was something I totally did not have interest in, I would say, before I started the PhD. I didn't know that precarity was such a gigantic like voluminous, frankly, literature in sociology. In fact, I think it's fair to say that within what was called labor sociology, which was a thing in the 1970s, I think a huge fraction of that has now become maybe more than half of all papers have something to do with precarity or job instability or the inability to find kind of full-time work. And I came into this from a very different perspective. I came into this because Sam Preston, who was a very famous, is frankly a very famous formal demographer. You can look him up. He has like 30,000 citations. He has this set of ideas about about the fact that, populations in the real world are non-stable. And there's a set of equations that govern the growth of non-stable populations that are indexed by age or by tenure or something like that. And if you write down those equations, you get all kinds of new estimation formulas and strategies for modeling and decomposing, the growth of groups by age or the life table for a population when you don't have the data that you want. And he said, well, if you think about job tenure, that's a lot like an age. And I've always thought it would be a good idea to try to apply this to job tenure. So in my second year of the program, I did some experiments. They all failed. I didn't understand quite what the algorithm was doing or what the method was doing, or even why you would use this method. And that's kind of an exciting story, but I had some results that looked interesting. Like, for instance, you could basically get a roughly downward sloping job survival curve. So you could estimate what's the probability that a job makes it to like 1 year on the job or 5 years on the job, with some assumptions. So, for instance, no dual job holding, that the job survival curve is homogeneous. It turns out that if you have multiple populations in there, you're not estimating the correct thing, and it's very hard to back out the correct thing. Obviously, in the real world, they're all multiple populations. This is like really an approximation that's meant to kind of inform you about the social process. And I applied for this Indira IPUMS conference on population aging. And I said, well, I have some results on job tenure indexed by age or like what the job survival curve is, indexed by age, sex, race, education. The good thing about demographic methods is that once you've kind of mastered one, and you like say mortality, you can then apply it to like every inequality that's out there. So you want to talk about class, race, sex, boom, that's three papers. So the very first person who invents any kind of new mortality analysis, they immediately get at least three or four papers because they could also do geography on and on this way. That's kind of the strength of demography, which is that in this world where academicians just always count instead of like trying to evaluate the quality of things, every time you come up with a new method, you've got like four papers out of it. I don't think economists do it like that. I don't think they like to do that kind of stuff. But among demographers, sociologists, it's totally acceptable. New method, I'm the only one who really knows it. I'm going to apply it to five different things. So I am no different from that. I get into this conference and it's like 4 days before, and I still have these like kind of clanky results. And I say, what turned out to be going wrong is that I'm analyzing the data in single year intervals, like single years of job tenure. And job tenure data suffers from something called digit preference. Do you know what digit preference is, by the way?
No,
I don't think anyone will know what this is.
no.
This is totally like demography esoterica. Digit preference is that people responding to surveys often in their cultures have numbers that are significant to them. So in China, 0, 4, 8, 12, on and on, but really multiples of 8 are special numbers. And so people are actually more likely to round their ages in the more pre-literate eras to 8, 16, 24, that kind of thing is my understanding. And in the Western world, 5, 10, 15, people will say, oh, I'm 45, when actually they're 42. And in job data, that problem is off the charts. You can see it because there's these spikes at 5 every year. And if you have surveys that are 2 years apart, let's imagine you see that there's like 1 million people who say they've been on the job for 3 years, 3 to 4 years. Well, you would expect 2 years later, the number of people who've been on the job for 5 years or more, that should be less than 1 million, because it's got to be those people who are at 1 million uh, at the who are at the 3 year mark. Who there are 1 million people who are at the 3 year mark who said they had that. Fast forward 2 years, it's got to be less than that, because some of them will have taken new jobs, and you find the opposite. Basically, you find that there's always too many people showing up at the 5 year mark. And that's also true for the 10 year mark, the 15 year mark, and so on. So that's digit preference. And that picture you get where there are these spikes at 5, 10, 15, demographers call that heaping. So digit preference is what describes the individuals who are responding to surveys. You say they have a digit preference. And then in your final aggregate of like the curve of the number of people, the histogram of the number of people who say I have 3 to 4 years of experience, 4 to 5 years, 5 to 6, and so on, that leads to heaps, these big jumps at the 5, 10, 15 year mark. And so I just give up. I say, okay, let's just model the 1, 5, 10, and 15 year marks. And actually, then the results come out quite beautifully. And it turns out, I didn't know this until later, and I had 3 days before the conference to like put all this together. That turns out to be exactly like the strength of variable R methods, which was the algorithm that Sam Preston was pitching to me. When it was presented to me the first time, I thought that it was somehow more accurate or adjusted for certain biases. It turns out when you really drill down, what it's really good for is dealing with this kind of messy data in which you have to do some kind of a bridging. And more conventional indirect methods, demographic methods that are for constructing life tables, they actually can't handle it when you group data where the age interval is not equal to the time interval. And in this case, since we're dealing with jobs, it's going to be the tenure interval is not equal to the time interval. So if you have surveys that are 2 years apart with conventional analyses, you need to analyze your data in like 2 year chunks. So a worker can be 0 to 2 years of tenure, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, and so on. With variable R, you can be much more flexible with that. And I had stumbled upon the exact strength of the method like 3 days before the conference. So I present the results come out very beautifully. And I realized at that conference that, okay, I've really stumbled onto something here, that I have found, I think, basically a new method that's compact, that gives you, in some ways, exactly what you're looking for from a job stability perspective. And it actually tells you some weaknesses of prior methods that are used, because the methods that are used often rely on these kind of regression analyses where I have a regression. I have mean job tenure on the left-hand side of the regression, and on the right-hand side, I'll have like year dummies. And so if you get a spike at a year dummy, that's meant to tell you, oh, job stability is increasing. But if you're a demographer, you can see immediately what's wrong with that, which is that it's neglecting the fact that you've got a hiring process and you've got like a job separation process, and they're both running at the same time. So I'll give an example of what can go wrong. Let's suppose you have a big recession and all the people who have like 1 to 4 years of tenure, they all get fired. But people who have more senior levels of tenure, who are basically like 4 to 20 years of tenure, they get to keep their jobs. And that's just the way your economy works. In that case, if you use the conventional regression method, you're going to observe that regressions appear to be, and it takes a while. Let's also pretend that once you're fired, it takes like a year or 2 years to get a new job, in a recession. It makes sense. In a conventional regression model, oh, this camera's messed up. In the conventional regression model, you're going to observe that it appears that actually the economy is getting more stable. And so you have these reports that are written by BLS and by others that are like, oh, the average years of tenure goes up in the Great Recession. And that is just the opposite of what you would want if you're analyzing job stability from a common sense perspective,
Because you
as well
fire
as
the
like from
short
a
tenure
modeling.
workers.
What?
Because the employers fire the short tenure
Yeah,
workers,
exactly,
the
exactly.
job
So you're
tenure
getting it
goes up.
totally wrong. You're getting it totally wrong. And there's many ways of actually dealing with this. If you read the especially economists, they've come up with a number of like clever, but I would say ad hoc methods. One group just says that we should just be using everything as like a multi-state life table, except with instead of life, we're going to be modeling tenure. And I think that's probably a reasonable approach. But the variable, but it doesn't yield necessarily compact estimators or estimation strategies. So I think that the tenure table is an approach I really like because it enables you to use all of these other demographic methods, like kind of canned formulas. I'm a big fan of like canned formulas. Canned formulas are well understood. Canned formulas are reproducible. Canned formulas usually have clean interpretations. And demographers have built up this huge statistical literature of how do we understand life tables, and we can use that applying this to jobs. So it turned out, I again didn't know this at the time, that if you go back to the 1950s, in the Keynesian era, they were first running into these problems where turnover was too high, and statisticians and labor statisticians, people who were interested in that, first began to really model the job separation process. And they actually pitched the idea of a tenure table, which is just a life table, but applied to jobs, where instead of age indexing your life, it's tenure that indexed the survival of a job. And they couldn't estimate these things actually. So they always had the idea that this was the ideal way to do it, but they had no real way of estimating it. So what they would do is they would say, okay, let's just assume that actually the distribution of job survival is exponential or something like that. They would just like fit a distribution, and you would get reasonable results like that. But it was not what they had in mind. It was not the idealized model that they had in mind. So I didn't realize it, but I had stumbled upon like the realization of what these people who tend to be called organizational demographers. Were you familiar with that? Did you ever stumble upon that in your studies? Organizational demography.
No, I'm not familiar with that field.
Right. So organizational demography was this attempt to use demographic concepts to study things like workforce diversity, um, to study things like why is it that when you hire a group all together, they all tend to leave at the same time. And that itself was a reaction to an earlier tradition in, I'll say, like business schools, which was focused on kind of psychological case studies. And what they would do is they'd have someone who would be a social scientist, sociologist, really. They don't like to call themselves that, but that's really what they were, who would go into firms and try to like analyze these teams and look at what caused people to stay or go in terms of retention. And the organizational demographers pointed out that in conventional demography, we have all these age period cohort effects, and we don't try to do more. Often we don't try to do more than that. So, for instance, if we observe that there's especially high attrition for a group of people who came into a firm in, say, 1990, we don't come up with a psychological theory of that. We just call it a cohort effect. And they had that idea. And that's, of course, borrowed from like mortality research, where we might observe that everyone who was born in 1900 had especially high mortality from 19, who had especially high mortality. Why? Well, because they were all exposed to like, say, World War I, influenza, and so on. So you can call that like a cohort effect. I guess those things are period effects that I'm describing. But if you observe that they all had this high mortality at a certain age, it's obviously the interaction of cohort and period, and not the age by itself. So that idea of trying to get away from psychological mechanisms and introduce these demographic approaches to simplify things, that becomes the organizational demography boom, which starts with a guy named Pfeffer. I think his name is Jeffrey. I can't remember his first name. But that paper, Pfeffer, Organizational Demography, 1983, it's a book chapter. It's actually hard to get. That racks up like 3,000 citations in the next 20 years and launches the organizational demography academic fad. And there were many unsolved problems in it. What exactly are we supposed to be modeling firms or workers or just everything using demographic techniques? But they always had this concept of like eventually everything could be reduced to tenure tables. And they actually never solved this problem of like how do we think about the mortality of jobs. So I didn't know it at the time, but I had stumbled into like the solution to that problem 30 years later. more or less, like 2023, and they cooked it 40 years later. And 1983 was when this was pitched. And so what do we do with this? Well, I realized, okay, this solves this old problem. And why didn't anyone solve this before? And the reason why is because academics have a lot of fads. And it turned out that in the 1990s, there was a paper. I can't remember what her name is. Let me look this up like right now. It was called The Black Box of Organizational Demography. Barbara, I think her name was Barbara Lawrence at UCLA, and she'd done a lot of these diversity studies. She was from the psychological camp. And her kind of counterattack was if you use this cohort thing or this like tenure thing, you actually haven't solved the original problem. And of course, the original organizational demographers were not trying to solve the original problem. Their idea was like, well, in other social sciences, they don't try to come up with these intricate psychological, social psychological models. They just point out that all these things are going to be correlated because they all share the same entry into the firm or they all have the same tenure, things like that. Well, Barbara points out that that's fine. You can do that, but you're not engaging with the rest of what we've done. So she calls this the black box problem, which is that if you say that they all entered at the firm at the same time, so they all leave at the same time, you haven't really gotten to any of the underlying psychology, which I think is a totally correct critique. But I think it's fairly devastating for the actual field because after that, if you look at citations and interest in this, it just totally dies. And so that's why there's these unsolved problems. If you read what the organizational demographers were trying to do, that's why there was no attempt to solve this in the next 20 years, let's say, after the 1996 paper comes out. And so that kind of solved that puzzle. For me, it made me realize, okay, I've stumbled onto something and it's kind of not clear what the meaning of this is, but let's try it anyway. And what I did was I published this as a methods paper in demographic research. That came out this fall, and it's called Point Estimation of Certain Measures in Organizational Demography. I think it's my first paper that's ever been kind of not cited. People like I don't know if it's been downloaded a lot. I saw it mentioned on Twitter exactly once by a colleague who said this is a very good paper, and a colleague is right. I think it's a lot of work that went into that. And it's actually my first publication in the PhD, and I had that I actually had all those equations and that kind of stuff more or less worked out with some caveats that are technical and detailed that I don't think we need to go into. I had that solved like 2 years ago, but I had all these other results that were puzzling to me because they seemed to be in tension with what I was reading about when it came to job precarity. So in the U.S. job precarity literature, there's something called it's not called this necessarily, but it's based. I call it the job stability paradox, which is why is it the case after globalization, after automation, after all these things, it's still the case that I think even in the conventional regression modeling approach, you observe actually that job stability has not gone down much in the 21st century. And I mean, think about how crazy that is. We had the Great Recession, we had the dot-com bubble, we had what else? We had the Great Resignation recently. We had basically all this automation AI stuff that's happening. So why is it the case that actually there's not more job instability in the labor market in the 21st century? And I had to figure this out. Do I find that when I use my methods? If you find this with conventional regression methods, and economists have multiple explanations for what's going on. So one of the economistic explanations is that what's actually going on is declining dynamism. Good ideas are getting harder to find. So the rate of startup failure, for instance, or the returns on startups seem to be going down. We have this idea of patents per capita, and patents per capita are going down. And when we try to look at like breakthrough ideas, like breakthrough patents per capita, we see that it also looks like breakthrough patents per capita are going down. This is an NBR paper from this year. And so economists' ideas like forget about the precarity. What's really going on is declining dynamism. And actually, both can exist at once in the sense that you have a crappy part-time job and it lasts forever. So you can have simultaneously declining business dynamism and high precarity. But sociologists' alternative explanation is that what's really going on is masked instability. So what's masked instability? Masked instability is, okay, the overall trend is towards less and less job stability across the entire economy. But there's an illusion caused by the fact that women are working much more. Women have become much more market oriented. They delay their fertility. They're much more likely to stick with their employers. There have actually been policy changes in the form of the Family Medical Leave Act in the early 1990s that gives you 12 weeks of leave whenever a family member dies or whenever you have a baby. It's unpaid, but you can stay with your employer. And if they don't keep you for 12 weeks, you can sue them. Um, Sociologists had argued that those kinds of changes were causing women to stay longer at their jobs, especially married women, and that was totally offsetting the male trend. And so, kind of the true trend is the male trend, but you have this other thing that's going on for women staying longer. And so, if you analyze the genders separately, you should be finding a declining trend for men and a rising trend for women, and the aggregate stable. So, those are kind of competing notions. There's a third notion, which was come up with recently by economists, although it had been theorized about for a long time, which is that with AI and big data technology, the job market matching process is actually getting better. And so now, before we hire you, we've scanned your DNA, we looked at everything you've ever posted on social media, we basically called your mother, your father, we have like way more information about you. And so every time you get a job, you're much more likely to be a good fit. And that's called the screening story. So those are kind of three stories about what's going on in job stability over time. And they can actually all be true to some extent. You could have higher precarity, you could have screening, and you can have declining business dynamism. And sociologists tend to say that what's really going on is this mass instability thing, and economists tend to emphasize these other two aspects. Okay, so what's my kind of intervention here? My intervention here is to say, why don't we try to very, very carefully measure job stability for each gender and see what's actually happening? And I find when I do that, that job stability has been going up for males and females since the 1990s. And the trend is kind of modest, but it's been going up. And so that actually raises severe questions. I would say not about the existence of mass instability, but about the relevance of mass instability. And what I mean by that is that I'm not looking at the period in which I think women became the most attached relative to their employers relative to men, which was the 1980s through the 90s, because I don't have the data to actually estimate my models in the earlier period at the moment. Maybe the data will come out. It is possible to construct it, but it simply hasn't been done yet.
Mhm.
And so if you look at the period after, for the 1990s, like our generation, it's actually been characterized by far more job stability. And my, I guess, second intervention, which is related, is that I look at what's going on by education group. And what I find is that job stability is really increasing for people who are in college. And it's, if anything, going down for people without a college degree. And sociologists have already developed a way of understanding that, which is called polarization. And so polarization is this idea that in the new economy, there's a large number of high quality jobs that are being created, and the rate of creation for like lower quality jobs is kind of the same. And so in that economy in which the middle is being hollowed out, it's assumed or found often, it's assumed and it's found that most of the high quality jobs are going to go to people with a BA. And many of the less quality jobs are going to be going to people without a BA who are kind of relegated to this other part of the economy. And earlier research had really rejected this notion. For instance, research focusing on cohorts born for the 1960s, let's say born in the 50s and 60s, and another set of cohorts born in the 20s through the 40s, found basically that job instability was increasing for all groups. And so on that basis, there was this kind of consensus that job stability was not polarizing, that all groups were having the same um, increase in job instability. And what I found is that may well have been true in earlier periods, but now it looks like everything is polarizing. Wages are polarizing, job stability is polarizing, part time, full time is polarizing. And I actually don't know if education is the right way to think about polarization. It's just an attribute that you can index on. One way you might want to index on would be looking at percentiles. Like if you had a way of constructing what's the 95th percentile of job stability versus the 5th percentile of job stability, there's just a divide, and education is going to be correlated with that advantage and disadvantage. And so I just found that education was an easy way to organize the results. But I think what's going on is that the overall economy has been polarizing in the 20th century,
Yeah.
21st century.
So the assumption here, if I understand, like the David Autor research, is that the middle wage occupations that are disappearing are the so-called production workers. So in the manufacturing sector, as well as I think office and office support, like secretaries and people like that. And then the jobs that are increasing somewhat in the new economy, right? Like your data scientists and
Management
your
is a big one,
engineers,
and
management.
management. So
Yeah.
people who are in managerial roles, that's also increased a lot in the
Uh,
21st century. And those are good jobs. Those jobs
Good
basically have
jobs.
healthcare. And it was assumed based on the earlier literature on precarity and the dissolution of internal labor markets found that a lot of that seemed to be concentrated in so-called white collar work. And I think that I haven't looked at class, for instance, with these methods, because these methods don't like lend themselves to analyzing class because the data is not quite ready. I'm trying to work on preparing a data set that would actually enable you to look at class. But when you look at education, earlier results found that actually the trend for college was maybe could be going down, could be going up. There was debate. And then for non-college, it was could be going down, could be going up. But on that basis, the other work that had been done lent itself to this conclusion that actually job stability is increasing for everyone. And maybe that was true in earlier periods. But I have found in my own research that job stability is increasing a lot for the college educated and decreasing for those without college, especially for women without a BA, which I want to point out also contradicts kind of a lot of the stereotypes and the imagery that had been developed, for instance, for studying job precarity. It was kind of assumed that it was males without a BA who were facing the most challenges in the new economy because of the lack of manufacturing. And my interpretation of what's happened is that the manufacturing transition, that a lot of that happened already in the 1980s and 1990s. And so when you get to the late 1990s and afterwards, there's something different going on. Um,
So what is the
and what
modal
I find
job
that's different,
for
please
so,
go
so,
ahead.
so what is the modal job for the woman without a college education? I mean, is it about like, I don't know, home health aides and like
Administrative, it would still be administrative
the
assistant. I mean, the
administrative
number
assistant?
one job that's held by women overall is administrative assistant, and that more or less is a rebranded version of the secretarial positions of the 1950s and 60s. And there's actually far more of them now than there
The
were
stuff that
back
the
then.
personal AI assistant would be able to handle nowadays, uh,
In theory, in
or
theory,
like
but a
Google.
personal AI assistant could create more jobs for a human if you're a super elite. Because there's some things you really want a human to do. You don't necessarily want to output everything into email. There's things where I want her to talk to someone with a human voice. And so that AI revolution has been ongoing, but it just hasn't. Well, you could argue that's showing up, and that's what's driving the decline in job stability for women without a BA. But I don't try to explain it. I just know that that's the trend in the data,
Well, the
and
main
it's
one
very
was the
different.
word processor, right? So
Word
you
processing.
introduced word processing. I mean, it used to be that the professors had secretaries that would type the papers, right? Which
Yeah, they would type the papers,
we
but
don't have
after
anymore.
you have your own word processor, you don't always fire your secretary because she can do email, she can do scheduling meetings. I mean, universities, for instance, have a lot more administrative staff than they used to. Even though, in theory, many of those jobs can be, automated. There's many things you just still want a human touch, and you also want a human to have responsibility for. That's the other aspect. You want a human who can be held accountable in the event that things go wrong with
Yeah,
some
but I
email
know
or
so in
conference.
my graduate department, so you had three, maybe four secretaries, right? And they were all for the entire faculty and for all of the students together, right? It wasn't that you had, let's say, one secretary for every two professors, right? You have a few people. I mean, like the graduate secretary, the undergraduate secretary, then you have the main department secretary, and then you have one or two others like admin people. But it does appear to me that there is a decline in the labor intensity for the administrative assistant industry. Um, so
Yeah,
but
I think that could be right that what's happening is their jobs are becoming more unstable. I think that it's possible. and that's what's driving the results I'm finding. But basically, what I am finding is that women in the 21st century, without a BA, do face increased precarity in the sense of increased job stability. So that's like kind of the key finding. And the I think more interesting aspect is it was originally believed, based on the results from the 70s through the 90s, that polarization was not a reasonable explanation or description of what was happening when it came to job stability. That job instability was increasing across all education groups. And I have found that's not true in the 21st century. In the 21st century, polarization certainly applies to job stability, educational polarization, just as it's applying to many other things like wages or access to so-called good jobs, full-time work, and so on. And so this to me is I think a helpful intervention, because it means that we don't need multiple frameworks for understanding what's happened. Basically, everything is polarizing all at once. That's what I think the contribution of this is. And what I do is I go a step further and I look at more or less what's happening by each tenure year. So like after you get hired, is job stability increasing in the first year for people without a college degree? Is it decreasing with a college degree? What's actually happening? And I find that almost all the gains in job stability have come from a reduction in job separation hazard in the first few years on the job. So it's not that you're getting a job for life. It's not that people are getting jobs for life. What's actually happening is you're not getting fired in your first year as much with a college degree.
But there's a
And so that
possibility that it
implies,
happens in later years. You could be fired
well,
in later
it
years.
happens at the same rate in later years, is the point. And so what that means is that although there's an increase in job stability in one sense, in the sense of expected tenure at hiring, lifetime jobs are not really making a comeback. Because when we try to look at longer term job stability, it seems like it's about the same. So the ratio of people, for instance, who make it to 5 years, who then make it to 20, I have a very compact way of estimating that using these tenure tables. And I find that the ratio that I call this conditional probability of a lifetime job, that's basically either stagnated or dropped for all the groups in the economy. So I call this diverging precarities. Because if you use one precarity measure, which is common sense to me, one estimand, which is the expected job tenure and hiring, you find the precarity is going down. If you use a different estimand, the conditional probability of a lifetime job, which, well, by the way, these all exist in the literature. I mean, in some form, people have talked about these. These are not like concepts I've made up. These are things that are out there, and I found a compact way of synthesizing all of this in like one model, one estimation strategy. I find that is either stagnating or declining for everyone. And so, what that kind of tells you is it's fair to describe that as being within the old precarization paradigm, in the sense that everyone is no longer having a lifetime job, but they are having longer and longer job spells if you have a college degree. And so those are the basic findings of the paper that I just finished and I just sent off. And I think that this kind of has important implications for labor markets, because it first of all highlights the fact that we need to be kind of careful about what are like the theories saying about particular estimands. I mean, when you think about the precarization literature, it's not obvious to me that it should be focusing on lifetime jobs, or should it be focusing on job spells, or what? It actually it's kind of a puzzle what it should be focusing on. The previous literature, a lot of it focused really on just mean years of job tenure. But mean years of job tenure can change because of fluctuations at the higher end, because now nobody gets a job that lasts for 30 years, or nobody wants a job that lasts for 30 years. But it could also be fluctuating because there's an increase in some sense in job separation rates at the lower end. And that would also tend to reduce the expected tenure and hiring. And I find that, for some groups, these things are happening all at once. So, for instance, women without a college degree arguably are facing higher job separation rates in the first year on the job, but they're also not having like more stable jobs when they have longer. When we try to look at longer term outcomes, so they're facing almost a double like increased job separation hazard from both directions. And you can kind of push that concept and see, what's driving that. But already to like analyze this, you get to 80 pages, and I think that's enough for one paper to go into what the proximate causes of the job separation process are,
Yeah, I mean,
and what's driving changes in it.
uh,
But that's what I found. And what is that consistent with when we go back to our original three models? Well, I do think that there is a sense in which precarization is increasing. And that's the sense of when we look at this lifetime job stuff. I think that's fair to say that the original precarity theorists, they would have predicted something like that, and I think that that's vindicated. But in another sense, I think that the polarization model is actually better at describing the shorter term outcomes, or things that are driven more by short term job separation hazard. And both of those are happening at once, and it just depends on where you focus on. And that kind of helps resolve a lot of the tension that's found, where people will look at one set of data, they'll find one thing, and they'll analyze the data slightly differently, and they'll find another thing. And the answer is actually both are happening at once. It just depends on where in the distribution you're looking. So that's the point of this paper. And previous work had made a lot about gender differences. And I find that the genders are actually very, very similar when you break down by education group. So although there's a negative trend for females and there's maybe a more stable trend for males, they still do look very similar when you just look at the graphic for non-BAs versus BAs. The dominant trend is the educational polarization, not the gender effects. And it also kind of tells us something about social history, which is that men and women looked the same even by the time you get to the 1990s. And that wraps up another result, which is people who were using the NLSY were not getting results that were very similar to what's found, not what you would expect if you were really bought into the masked instability paradigm. And I find that when I look at this from a period perspective, just looking at like 1996 to 1998, 1998 to 2000, and try to look at the job separation hazards in each of those intervals all the way up to today, men and women just look very similar. So the convergence in male and female on the job behavior happened, I think, a little bit earlier than social science historians have given it credit for. And it also means maybe if you want there to be more convergence in outcomes for males and females, let's say wages uh, or occupational attainment, something like that, it kind of tells you to be a little bit pessimistic about that, because those things haven't converged, but many other dimensions of behavior in the workforce have converged. And so those things that haven't converged, there might be something more stubborn underneath the surface that's driving that. That's just different from the job separation process. And so earlier work in like economics, for instance, found that it had argued, I think, and these are contested results, that when we look at, say, racial stratification, blacks and whites, this is a paper that argues this, had very similar job stability. That actually the stratification that goes on when it comes to incomes and resources and occupational attainment is a different process than you having a relatively stable job. And I think that I don't know how true that is for race. I actually I'm not going to talk about that. I have a paper that's in progress that really goes into the race stuff, and I don't find that they're similar. But for gender, it is true that they're actually very, very similar at this point in U.S. history. And I don't go into why, because there's a lot of work that just goes into the modeling of these things. That throat clearing, in any paper you have like huge fractions of it just go into like throat clearing and setting up your models and stuff. But I do think that that's an interesting project for future people to look at, is why and how, because it could be the case that males and females are similar because they differ in job displacements, or they differ in the probability of quitting, or the probability of retiring, things like that. So those proximate causes of job separation, I think, are probably different for each sex and race and class grouping. But people have not really tried to look at that. I think it's extremely important. I mean, and I think part of the problem with it, especially for class, to go on a bit of a tangent, is because sociologists of class seem to assume that basically there's no like long spells of unemployment that vary by class. On average, the average paper that looks at like class and stuff like that will find, okay, in one class there's a wage disadvantage, but they may neglect that those classes have had different histories of employment and unemployment. Marx, by the way, kind of gets this right. He talks a lot about unemployment and the reserve army of the unemployed, and in his like two-class model, unemployment disciplines the proletariat in a way that it doesn't discipline the bourgeois. I don't know how much I buy that. I don't know if it's quite that stark. But the idea that when we think about class, we also should be trying to integrate unemployment and kind of the way that you leave your job, like class and the job separation process. I think that's a huge lacunae in the sociology of work and organization today that someone will work on eventually.
Well, I mean, Adam Smith has a much, easier way of describing why the capitalists have it easier or better than the workers. And he uses the example of basically the concept of savings. So the idea is that if the worker goes on strike, he oftentimes does not have a strike fund. So that was of course, he wrote in the 18th century before unionization, right? So the workers would basically, starve to death, and they would quickly come back to work. Versus an employer, let's say, maybe not the smallest business, but let's say a medium-sized business at the very least. If all the workers quit at the same time, he has, at least 1 year of savings. Basically, he could liquidate all of the capital in his assets, and he could still live off of that for a very long time. That's why he could, survive potential worker strike for much longer. So that's kind of the class distinction that Smith had pointed out. Yeah, I wanted to raise another point, which on your point about educational polarization, and of course that links up with the Case and Deaton death of despair argument, right, regarding the elevated mortality for I think white middle-aged working
Not
class
non-college. I mean, they think about it as
non-college.
BA versus non-BA in
That's
the
right.
book.
So it was a specific demographic group where they were saying that in the 1990s and then throughout the 2000s, you are seeing this increasing trend. But then the hopeful story kind of was that for other demographic groups like African Americans, like minorities, women, I mean, groups that you would think to be more economically vulnerable generally, you did not see the increase in mortality. Now, but then I saw this article recently, but I think this week's Economist magazine, where they showed the most recent update. So basically, not just stopping at 2010, but looking at the data up until kind of around the pandemic. Um, and so the 2010s data, and actually, you do see um, a convergence in the rise in the mortality trends across the different socio-demographic groups, so including African American, including women, and so the mortality rates increasing across the board, and thereby basically the death of despair is not this kind of localized phenomenon that you could say targets a specific group, right? The middle-aged men. Um, and it's quite interesting about like, okay, then you try to go into go, why is this happening? And um like this universalizing of this like death of despair concept. I mean, maybe it has something to do with like the underlying economic instability that kind of you were trying to identify in your research. Maybe certainly, I mean, drug overdoses and drug poisoning, right? I mean, that seems to be that you know single factor. I mean, because if you decompose the cause of death, I think like suicides, for instance, are actually are quite stable. I mean, it seems to me that and even firearm deaths, I mean, are only increasing slightly.
Yeah,
But
so we should maybe define deaths of despair. So deaths of despair in Case and Deaton's world have three components. Things that are related to alcohol, liver cirrhosis, liver disease, all of that. Suicides and opioid deaths.
and the drug, and it seems to be that the opioid is the main factor behind uh, you could say the increase in mortality across diverse demographic
Yeah, so
groups.
opioid deaths, I believe, are the ones that have converged by race. by race and by sex, where originally they were concentrated in one group, and now it seems like they're being held by all groups. I mean, the case of Newton results have proven very controversial. Certainly, their interpretation has not been universally accepted at all. And I have to admit that when I started this project and saw the divergence in job stability, I became very curious because it seems to be evidence for the case in Deaton story, where people with a college degree seem to be much more resistant to these specific causes of death than people without a college degree. That does seem to be what I'm finding. Well, I do find results that would plausibly be part of that story, where job stability is going up for all these groups except one. And I also want to say that there's other caveats about that, even just the raw increase in mortality. Hendy, who's a professor of demography at Princeton, at your old alma mater,
And he
he
graduated
basically
at Penn,
finds
right?
that he was at Penn, he went to Princeton, one of these guys. He finds that the increase in mortality is concentrated in women without a high school degree. So there's a difference between mortality stagnation, where every other group is experiencing declines in mortality, which is what we expect. That's the historical pattern. In fact, the case in Deaton results are very shocking because there's entire statistical modeling strategies that are used by insurance companies, by the Social Security Administration, and of course by academics and statisticians that rely on the fact that mortality goes down every year. So there's a model by what's his name? Ron Lee. It's Lee and someone else. Lee, and we can look it up actually. Ron Lee. It's his most cited paper, I think, actually. Lee Carter model. And the Lee Carter model basically assumes that mortality goes down every year, at least at the population level. And so the case Deaton results are fairly shocking because they say that this model, which had been used successfully, was wrong in some sense for some groups since at least the late 1990s.
Now,
And so I think that yeah, so please go ahead.
now, so if you have like the increase, let's say the most recent one, okay, 21, 22, I mean, I would expect the increase in mortality because of the pandemic. I mean, you do see the mortality numbers rising, across the world. I mean, in different countries in the world. So, um, I mean, so as we're coming out of a pandemic, I mean, we're going to see more figures trickling in. I mean, I should expect that, that we are, you could say, back on track, so to speak, regarding decline in excess mortality. I guess it's a hope. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm
Well,
not in
excess
the,
mortality comes from a model, so you kind of have to be kind of careful about that because it would be excess mortality relative to 2019. And you don't know if the 2019 is like the right baseline year for everything forever, right? So there's a sense in which if you're using excess mortality as a model, that's very, very good for short term, something's going wrong. So if you observe that excess mortality is high in 2020, 2021, and then you introduce a vaccine and it goes down a lot, that's very informative. But it's not necessarily informative as we get into, like, say, 2024, 2025. That's conventional wisdom among demographers, is that you have to be kind of careful about what the baseline is for excess mortality, because we could observe that we get negative excess mortality, if we have some big AI in medicine or something like that in 2025 or something. So I think maybe the concept would just be mortality rates are going to come down relative to 2021, 2022. I think that would be the right concept.
but then you also have so the baby boomers. I mean, that big cohort that is getting into their late 70s, even 80s now. I mean, so is an expectation that in the coming years that we should expect like a cohort driven increase in like total mortality.
Yeah, so you would expect crude death rates to go up. So that's one mortality measure. But age specific death rates shouldn't change. Not just by the fact that you have different cohort sizes. So there's going to be more deaths and there's going to be a higher crude death rate, but there's not necessarily going to be an increase in age specific deaths. Now, I actually do think there's going to be an increase in age-specific deaths, and age-specific deaths could go up because you're running into diminishing returns with medical technology, and I think as well cancers are going up, and I basically buy the idea that in modern life people have a lot more social and psychological problems than they used to, and so I actually do think that age-specific deaths are going to go up, but that's not necessarily just because the baby boomers are old. There's other social underlying kind of social phenomena that are driving changes in age-specific death rates.
So that is to say, so if you're seeing a substantial spike in, let's say, middle-aged or younger people that are, you know, I don't know, committing suicide or are, hooked up on the opiates, that this would actually have um an impact on mortality that is basically not driven by, you could say, biological limits, effectively, right? Like
Yeah,
dying at a
exactly.
very old age.
Exactly. And in fact, I want to point out one more thing about Ron Lee and that whole literature, which was there was a gentleman who died. And actually, the paper I published, Point Estimation of Certain Measures in Labor or in Organizational Demography Using Variable R Methods, um, he was an advocate of the view that life expectancy would trend up like for a very long time. And he believed that basically because of increasing medical improvements, the de-risking of life, we no longer have a big industrial economy, and people used to die actually a lot in that economy. That's kind of gone. And with that, he argued that there were all these like forecasted limits on the growth in life expectancy, and they had all been broken, going back to 1600. And sadly, he died during COVID-19. And I looked into it. I was very curious about this because he died at 78, which is like very close to the male life expectancy. And, and he'd taken care of himself. He lived very well, totally successful life. And I asked people what happened. And actually, it was isolation. It was the lockdowns, more or less, in Germany that isolated him from his family and friends. And I think after that, he wasn't doing well because I think that there's some people they're extroverted. They need to be talking to people and in the society. And he was one of those people where, absent his friends and family, I think he was just not going to thrive. That's the story I'd heard. And so there's a gigantic literature that he helped found starting in the 1980s that looked at kind of the causes, biodemography. What are the biological causes, proximate causes at least, of increasing life expectancy? And I think all of that literature in the next, I don't know how many years, is going to need to be turned on its head if current trends continue. And I think that's what you're getting at as well, that we have all these expectations about health improvements that are not materializing, or there might be other trends that are going on that are overwhelming the health improvements that we had come to expect as younger people, because that was actually what the literature said, and that was what had happened throughout much of the 20th and early 21st century. And those trends, I think, have largely reversed. And so some of them we can identify. So, for instance, we've gotten very good at reducing cardiovascular diseases, like, okay, you need to run and jump. And I think eventually obesity, things like that actually overwhelm the gains that we could have from newer medical technologies. That was kind of one end of it. So people do have fewer heart attacks, but they have lower, let's say, health expectancy throughout their lives. And so they just don't necessarily reap the gains you would expect from medical improvements. And I think as well, when it comes to things like reductions in cancer deaths, the reductions in cancer deaths earlier in this century were quite small. So the war on cancer, I think, if you look at it from the 20th century, basically a failure. There's papers that had come out in 2010, around that time, that said when you try to factor in early diagnosis, because we test for cancer much more, we've got much better testing. A lot of the increase in life expectancy conditional in getting cancer is an illusion. Because, okay, earlier you would have died at age 62, and we would have caught the cancer a month before, right when you died. So you would have had like a month of life expectancy after cancer diagnosis. Now we test you much more. So when we test you at 60, it appears that, oh, you're living much longer. But it's not really an increase in your life, given that you have cancer. It's just that we've gotten much more rigorous with our testing. And so you appear to live much longer. And so earlier in the
So if I
1990s, there
catch
were
you
all
at
these
stage
results about,
one cancer, then
yeah,
then we
yeah.
can easily fix that.
Well, so that's the effect that I didn't bring up, but is very relevant, which is that it turns out, of course, that if you diagnose things much earlier, you can also treat them much better. So there are many cancers where testing has yielded probably a boom, but you can't tell because the direct effect. The most obvious effect is not that, oh, you're much better at medicine necessarily, but just that you've caught it much earlier. We started measuring your clock, your countdown much earlier because we test much more. So both of those are effects were playing the data. And in 2010, most of the research I had seen suggested that the balance was actually more towards the pure testing effect rather than the, okay, now that we've caught you at stage one instead of stage four, we can actually treat this. And now I don't know if that's true. However, there's a caveat. It turns out that the causes of death, like things that can kill you in your 70s, are pretty dense. So there's an article by Kefitz that points out that if we eliminated all cancers, just wipe them all out, no one will ever die of cancer again. What do you think the gains in your life expectancy are?
Well, I did read the Angus Deaton book, and he said there was like 4 years or something.
Oh, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's about
Yeah,
4 years.
four
And
years.
the
Yeah.
reason is because when you get older, you get frailer. So you fall down. I mean, it makes sense. You're a social scientist, so you're going to get this. But you fall down the stairs. There's all these other things that can kill you. Random disease. You catch a cold. You get the flu. So it's not enough. People, there's this new movement of people who want to live forever. The longevity movement. It's led by Brian Johnson on Twitter. He says he wants to live forever, and he's doing all these medical things. And I am very pessimistic about the prospects of that because it's not enough to prevent just like cell senescence and death. You have to do something about frailty at that age. And also, you have the problem that there's many systems that go wrong at once. So, okay, maybe you don't have cancer, but then you have Alzheimer's disease, which can be induced by cancer, but it's not a cancer. So, basically, you have this problem that you actually need to cure all of the systems for you to be able to live forever. And it's not obvious that we're going to be able to do that. I'm very pessimistic. I'm very optimistic about any particular disease that we'll be able to make progress at it by throwing resources at it. But all the diseases, I don't know. That's a tall order.
I mean,
And certainly the trends from the 2010s have not led people, I think, to be optimistic about prospects for doing that.
yeah, I mean, I did listen to the Brett Weinstein podcast about, like talking about his research on like biology and like senescence of the cell. And I mean, so I don't re recall all of the details, but it seems to be the main argument is that, so as you get older, I mean, the telomeres in your cells are getting shorter, and then and then at some point, um, yeah, you have like the final cell death, and that will manifest in, I don't know, your heart stops beating or something like that, right? So that I'm not sure whether um that sort of biological limit can necessarily be breached. I mean, it can certainly be. I mean, we can stretch for as long as possible, right? We can get rid of the cancers, we can get rid of the cardiovascular, and so on and so forth. But the bigger concern, I mean, I have been very interested in like health related issues in the recent past. You know, because I had this elevated blood pressure issue.
Oh, I
And
didn't know that.
yeah,
You're,
yeah,
you're
well,
telling me for the first time. Yeah,
yeah, and then of course I started to research on my own and things like that, and then I sort of came across this like ketogenic diet concept of like reducing carbohydrates and
did that work for you? I'm curious.
the
Have you tried to
sugar
do that?
intake. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I have reduced substantially. I mean, I don't eat much bread. I mean, I still eat a little bit of oatmeal, a little bit of rice, but not as much as I used to. I think it has been helpful. I mean, I think the blood pressure is lower now without any intake of medicine. So that seems to be a big benefit. And also another thing I noticed is stress, right? So if I'm thinking about something, if I'm stressed about submitting a paper or getting ready for a class or anything like that, then there's an elevation there. So being calm is actually very important. But yeah, so and and then yeah, so I found out a lot about this idea of um basically, I mean, how the food companies are working kind of synergistically with the healthcare system to basically, make the population fatter and sicker and only treat diseases without necessarily curing them, right? I mean, so basically, what's happened is, I mean, long story short, I mean, um, you have corn, and you have the soybeans, right? That are the most subsidized uh, food crops in the U.S. agriculture system. And well, if you subsidize it, then you produce huge amount of it, and then you're like, okay, well, you're gonna have to put this into the food products, and we're gonna have to sell that to the public. So if you go to the supermarket, I mean, most of the middle aisles are basically, ultra processed food, right? High sugar foods, corn syrup is one of the core ingredients.
It
And
is true what you're saying. I mean, it's definitely true. I don't know about the idea that the companies are doing this intentionally, but it's obviously true that the average American diet's bad. But I also think that there's something else going on because if you went to China or Japan and you ate a high carb diet, you would almost certainly lose weight. I mean, is that have you ever traveled to Asia or even Europe? I've noticed this myself. I'll travel there and I'll eat whatever I want all the time, and I will lose 20 pounds reliably. I think there's something very odd going on with American food that I don't know if we've really pinned it down. I mean, there's
so you think
theories,
it's a
but
GMO crops?
maybe not. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything that's hard evidence that's like this is what it is, because otherwise people would solve it. But I think that basically, I mean, think about it. Like if you eat an all rice, there's rice and fish. Well, fish is good, but rice and high carbs, white carbs especially, are a staple in Japan, and yet people are thin. And that's also true in China. And yet most people are thin. It's so it can't be as simple. I mean, I've used the ketogenic diet in America and it has worked for me. But it can't be, there has to be something else going wrong that we have to adopt this crazy diet to be in like reasonable shape versus when we turn to our fellow members of the human race in Europe and East Asia, and we find that they're eating something where if you believe the keto theory, they should be obese, and they're much less obese than we are. So I think that there's a major puzzles in nutrition and health that I have not gotten to the bottom of, and I don't think there's serious efforts to solve. I'm not impressed by a lot of the efforts that have been made to solve this. And I'll give an example. There was an interesting Twitter thread I saw on calorie intake, and it points out that if you look at calorie intake in the 1950s and you look at people who are taking in 3,000 calories a day, which would be fat. I mean, that would basically, that diet today would make you fat. They were thin, they were in good shape. So I don't know if it's just calories. I suspect that there are additives in the food, probably things that do make it cheaper. There's like probably some economistic, calculation that's going on that on average makes it cheaper. Like corn syrup is a reasonable culprit. It's a reasonable smoking, you could say smoking gun, things like that, but maybe not just that. That when you add them to the food, regard keeping the calorie constant, keeping the caloric uh, intake constant means that somehow you'll just like burn it less effectively, or you're less likely to move it through your system so quickly. That's like a theory that I have just based on like looking around, but I don't know what the additives are. It's totally speculative. It's like totally a black box about what's going on. But the major puzzle for me is that why is it the case? And you observe this with immigrants too. When immigrants come to America and they try to replicate the same diet they had back home, maybe plus 500 calories because they're richer, they get much bigger if they don't try to do anything about it, if they don't consciously take steps, and their kids get much bigger. So it's not just a genetic, kind of story. I mean, there could be a genetic element to this. I'm sure there are, but there's something that's happening in the American food, um, in the American food supply that I think is different from what's going on in other countries. And I just have not seen impressive efforts to figure out what it actually is. And so ketogenic, that works, but isn't it a puzzle? Like, why is it the case that people are on the reverse ketogenic diet in other countries and they're thin?
It is an interesting question, but I did find it interesting that so if you look at the diabetes rates by ethnic groups, so So within the U.S., you find that especially the South Asians, so like Indians, Pakistanis, and so forth, they seem to have the highest susceptibility to diabetes because the pancreas does not is not insulin sensitive, right? So it doesn't secrete a lot of insulin. But interestingly, the same issues arise also in India itself. So I mean, you do have. I mean, if you hold the BMI constant, which is generally one of the indicators that's correlated with diabetes, you still find that there is a higher susceptibility among the South Asians to its developing diabetes, and then specifically, I think the two very southern provinces like Kerala and Tamil Nadu that are very rice heavy. The northern parts are more wheat heavy. Um, you do see relatively the highest rates of diabetes, and there's a very heavy reliance upon carbohydrates. I believe that 70% of the diet in India itself is grains. So either
Yeah,
rice
so
or
that's
wheat.
consistent. That's consistent with the model. I guess we would need to really look at the diet of like Japanese and Chinese to figure out if it's quite different than Indians. Because Japanese and Chinese, I mean, Japan also has a very heavily subsidized white rice industry,
Yeah,
right? And they have very cheap
For
white
the East
rice.
Asians, I think that there is a higher susceptibility to its diabetes than for whites and Europeans, but it's lower than for the South Asians. And so, I mean, I read this paper somewhere in some medical journal, which basically made the argument that those of European descent have, you know, are the most, insulin sensitive. That is to say, the lowest take up of susceptibility to diabetes, um, because because of the longest exposure in terms of the timeline towards grains.
I like the
I mean,
evolutionary timeline.
right, so from an evolutionary timeline. So basically, I mean, so the first like grain growth, you could say, about 12,000 years ago. So after that last ice age, when conditions. Well, I mean, not in Europe, but I think in Mesopotamia, really. I think like around
Right,
Iraq,
because they were
Syria,
first to agriculture, and a lot of those people migrated into
agriculture.
Europe. So the
Yeah,
first
that's
to
right.
agriculture hypothesis, I think that's pretty, or like more modern agriculture. I think that's pretty fascinating. There's a lot of research on that related to disease outbreak, and so there's an argument that diseases are more likely to jump maybe from Asians to animals and vice versa because they've had animals that live with them for I forget if it's a long time or a short time, but basically something about the way they live with animals today obviously increases the probability of disease jumping, like rural China, Thailand. We have a high expectation, but there's also arguments about evolutionary vulnerability to this because maybe they haven't cultivated animals or lived with animals as long as like say some European populations. So is it true? I don't know. I mean, I think that this evolutionary stuff is very fascinating, but it's certainly out of my purview. And I don't know how you would know. You need often these the just so story critique, right?
I that's all like correlation without necessarily
Well, it's
causation.
correlation, but you need for it's a just so story in the sense that you observe that there's diseases, that there's a high level of animal human disease transmission in Asia. And so then they argue that basically, oh, that there must be an evolutionary explanation, and we come with this idea that they cultivated animals or they worked exclusively with rice for a little bit longer before they turned to animal cultivation. And so that's kind of what's explaining the fact that infectious diseases that are fatal seem to jump more between these populations. And that's like an argument that you come up with. But it's a just so story because you were only using it to explain the original fact. And so to overcome that critique, evolutionary psychologists and people in that field have said that you need to have another thing, which is you need to make another prediction. If that's true, what's another prediction about the social world that would come from that story? And then if you do that, basically then you've made it something that's a little bit more scientific. You've kind of satisfied Popper's falsifiability criterion as much as you can do with a social theory. So I'll give an example. Uh, there's a researcher named Gadsad, and very controversial. I'm not going to talk about what he
Yeah, I
does
listen to his
outside of
podcast.
his
Yeah, I know about
out
this
of his
guy.
papers, his
Yeah.
podcast. But I will say that he was a pioneer in this because there were all these theories about men and women giving each other money and things like this, and they all looked to me like just so stories. And he found one that I think was really not a just so story that overcomes the scientific criticism. And the one that he did that overcomes, I think, the scientific criticism is he looks at paternal grandparent versus maternal grandparent giving to grandchildren. And the argument from paternity security is that a maternal grandparent knows that the grandchildren are theirs, so they should give more money. And they do, compared to the paternal grandparents. And it's very difficult to think of a mechanism through which that could be the case, besides this kind of evolved paternity uncertainty leading to differential gift giving mechanism that the evolutionary psychology people have come up with. So I would think of that as something that's very surprising, that's not a just so story, that I think that if evopsych people went down that path more, they would have, I think, more to say to sociologists, and it would be more of interest, I think, to people who do research on the conventional social sciences. But many evolutionary psychologists, certainly the early ones from the 1980s, if you try to read them with the criticism of this looks like a just so story, you'll find that many of them don't overcome that barrier. So I think that basically that's kind of the thing to ask about from a scientific perspective. Not that the theory could be false or true. By the way, it could still be true. But we have a scientific criterion of, okay, what is it, does this explain anything else about the world besides the original empirical observation? And I think that's something that when it comes to explaining the history of disease, I don't know if many of these theories have done that yet. So that's just something that maybe of interest to the one listener or the few listeners of this
Yeah,
podcast. The just
sure.
so
I
story.
mean, regarding the paternity thesis, I mean, I'm sure
Yeah,
that there's certain psychological studies, I'm sure, that show that like the mental health or outcomes of like adopted children is perhaps not going to be as good as for like the biological like those who are raised by biological parents. And maybe that has to do certainly with you know maybe the amount of investments that are being done
yeah,
to raise
parental investment.
biological
I
children.
think that that's all true. I basically there's something to that for sure, but you can come up with other stories because the adopted population is very heavily selected on. They might have more behavioral problems because their parents might have more behavioral problems, which is how they got to be adopted. So it's not there's more than one thing changing besides adoption versus biological child. Um,
So it's not just
I
about parental investment, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's actually many. So I think what one thing you're pointing out is that there's actually many stylized facts that are consistent with the idea that paternity uncertainty reduces parental investment. And I think that that is absolutely true. So I think that there is a role then for evolutionary psychology in helping us to integrate many facts into a single compact model that we've already observed. Still, I think it would be better from a scientific perspective if we could make novel predictions that are then verified. And Gadsad was the one who said, okay, here's a novel prediction that we can actually test. And he tested it and he found that it was consistent with the paternity uncertainty hypothesis. So I think there's two different scientific things that we could be trying to do. I mean, one, which is what I like. I mean, I have a research style that's like the style that I was just criticizing, which is of trying to subsume everything, trying to come up with a minimal set of descriptions that explain as many social phenomena as possible. And I think there's a role in evopsych for that. But I think that that's normally not from a social scientist perspective, like totally satisfactory. I think we also want something that predicts something else that we didn't originally observe, like in the economistic approach, where we have a model, we observe A and B, and our model predicts A and B, but it also predicts C. Well, let's look in the data and see if C is true. And if we see C is true, I think that it would be then strong evidence for the model that also predicted stuff we already knew.
Yeah, those kinds of um, theorems. I mean, I do think that, I mean, the whole point of, the social science enterprise, or, the science enterprise in general, I mean, is to find, you could say, generalizable, statements, that well, either A causes B, which is a quite a strong statement, or, I mean, but even if you just said, A is related to B, or A covaries with B, I mean, so just correlational studies. I mean, I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, to just point out that those relationships between, variables exist. This I think there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I remember I had this one conversation with Jim Ramo, as a demographer at Princeton, and during a lunch, and we had this debate about, like, causation versus correlation, and then he said that, so, in the demography world, I mean, we are mainly in the world of correlation. About just, okay, you have, let's say, the outcome would be the mortality that we talked about, right? And then the X variable. I mean, yeah, you're gonna go through the literature, and you try to find, you know, uh, whatever explanations, or no, not explanations, but, like, other things that mortality co-varies with. So, like race, or,
Yeah,
gender,
I
things like
don't
that.
mean to criticize that work. Much of the, by the way, the work I described earlier in this podcast was exactly that kind of associational stuff. I don't mean to criticize that, but what I mean to say that if we're going to do this kind of correlation mining, we should ask if we have an underlying theory, does it make predictions about correlations that we would see in the data? I think that that's still a fair thing to ask, that we should make a novel prediction about a correlation in the data. What
Yeah,
do you
yeah.
think about that? That if we have a social theory to predict something we wouldn't expect otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit too abstract. I mean, obviously, I mean, you'd have to apply this to some use case, and then I could tell you, it's like, okay,
Well,
this, let's say,
So we can
makes
go back to
sense
the GAD-SAT
or
example.
not.
So why would it be the case that paternal grandparents give less to their grandchildren at a birth than maternal grandparents?
And so there's an assumption that I guess, those paternal grandparents, if they're not sure about, blood links to the grandchild, that they would be less committed to helping out that grandchild. Yeah, I mean, also the other thing, I mean, so across different cultures, I mean, almost all cultures in a way are, patriarchal in their setup, and specifically regarding naming traditions, right? So, certainly the Western culture, I know the Asian cultures definitely work like that. The African culture. So, I mean, where, why would you have to take your father's last name instead of your mother's last name? And it appears to me that it has to do with the at the very least the legal assertion of paternity, right? Because, I mean, you don't have to assert who your mom is, because, you basically, plopped out of a body. But for for the father, I mean, you might say, well, okay, there could be uncertainty about, whom did the mother sleep with eventually, um, and therefore, like, being named after the father is kind of just to show to the whole world that, okay, this person, this man is responsible for these children, right? Um, and what's quite interesting is that almost all the cultures, it seems to me, in the world are, following this particular practice, right?
Yeah, so what would be the prediction of the theory? The prediction of the theory would be that if we find a way to get to 100% paternity certainty in one of these otherwise patriarchal cultures, then the naming conventions should become weaker.
if we could uh so if every baby that is born, we do the paternity test
Yeah.
on the child. I mean, but that would be weird in a way, because I mean, so if every man who is presumably going to become a father would make this, you could say, demand upon his wife to do this paternity test. I mean, I think it would create
Oh,
quite a
or basically, like, let's just
messy
say that it
situation.
becomes a government policy that the hospital will paternity test your kids because we want to avoid any future child support, or even in China where they have like a lot of genetic testing for diseases at birth. It's something the government would know immediately and maybe tell the father. It becomes a very accessible information. My expectation is that if you believe that the reason why they're getting these names is to reduce the perceived threat of paternity uncertainty, this like psychological thing, then if they don't have that kind of threat anymore, then basically they shouldn't care as much about the name. All right, you want to have your mom's last name? It's all good. That would be the prediction that I would make. I mean, do you agree that that's a reasonable prediction from this model?
Um, yeah, sort of, but I mean, like, so as sociologists, I mean, we know that, like I think Weber calls it, like the power of the traditions, which has been pursued from time immemorial, right? I think that's the language that he used. Um, and in other words, humans love tradition, and why should we, fix something that is not broke, so to speak? I don't
All right,
know.
but let's then okay. Let's just do the same thing, but now we run it like for a thousand years, 1,000 years of just knowing exactly who your child is. I think in that society, the patriarchal naming convention just breaks down. What do you think about that? Because okay, your argument about tradition kind of kicks the can down the road, and like I feel that traditions do break down. Sometimes they break down just for stochastic reasons. So I think that they wouldn't break down if they served some function where if you didn't have it, the society falls apart. So then patriarchal naming conventions persist in a high paternity uncertainty environment to alleviate the psychological stress that the father faces. But we eliminate the source of psychological stress, presumably the convention breaks down eventually. Do you agree with that, or do you just, because it's very difficult to make cultural theories, I think, or social theories, if you're not willing to ask, what kind of change would cause another change in the society?
I mean, so I think, so I'm not able to answer that question because it depends to what extent people believe that this is a controversial topic. I mean, like, for instance, I mean, like, so I think before that repeal of Roe versus Wade, for instance, I think that there was a kind of impression, at least among the more liberal segments of society, that, at least at the federal level, that the issue of abortion would be uh, resolved, right? And clearly, this was not the case. And so, but that's because, I mean, with the abortion, I mean, it's kind of whenever you could say the liberals have made some legislative advancements, or some legal advancement, um, then the conservative side would then get up and mobilize and counter mobilize, and try to get conservative judges appointed and so forth. So I mean, but you see, the issue with the paternal naming convention is that it does not seem to me that this topic rises to a level of controversy. Now, if it did, I'm not saying this is never possible. So if it did, then yes, I think that we would be we could challenge the naming convention. I mean, certainly more progressive people, I mean, they kind of already say, um, well, let's say that, you could name the daughters after the mother and then the sons after the father or something like that. I don't know.
I suspect that that's still consistent with the evolutionary model because progressive people are more educated and therefore probably have less paternity uncertainty. My feeling is that conservatives tend to be less educated on average, and if they're white, they tend to be, the stereotype is that they're less likely to be college educated. And we know that paternity uncertainty tends to be higher in groups that are less, have lower SES, certainly within race. And so to me, that's totally consistent with the evolutionary logic.
Um, well, I mean, so but you see, that's the thing. I mean, the naming convention is not a topic where, let's say, the liberal people are having a position that is opposed to the conservative. I mean, it just does not rise up to be an issue. I mean, for instance, I mean, if you look at like anti-tobacco regulations, right? Where, I think up until like whatever 1950s, 60s, I mean, you see these, smoking advertisements everywhere. And right now, I mean, I think in the UK they were talking about outlawing cigarettes for people born after 2008. Um, and so, I mean, you can kind of see, I mean, it has become an issue where, there's no polarization. I mean, there's no conservative and liberal dispute on this topic, and so so that's
Right.
why, I mean, I just don't see that this,
You see, you have kind of an
paternal
arenas
naming.
model. It needs to become an issue in the social arena for
Yeah,
it to
that's right.
actually be challenged. And if there's no social arena, then basically whatever the evolutionary drivers are, they're just too weak of a force. That maybe this was cooked up 10,000 years ago for evolutionary psychological reasons, but those forces today are actually too weak to have any effect on outcomes. Is that kind of a reasonable interpretation of what you're saying?
Yeah, and
Unless you politicize it, unless you make it a social political issue.
yeah, and I just don't see the cause why, this would change any time in the future. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think, so are social norms, traditions important? I mean, I had this conversation with a few friends in the past, regarding this idea of, like, needing to have a common myth. So I mean, this goes back to an argument by Yuval Harari, the Israeli historian, journalist. And so he kind of argues that you could say what has kept society together is it must be some common myth that we all kind of agree on and believe in. And so, I mean, for instance, I mean, this whole concept of like Western civilization, I mean, really, I think it is, traceable to this like Old Testament story, right? With, God creates the earth in 6 days. You have Adam and Eve. You have Abraham and his children, and so on and so forth. So, um, and um, and so those old ideas, I mean, you could say, I mean, if you try to take an objective lens at it, you might say, okay, this is a ridiculous story. I mean, this can, not have happened, etc. Um, but but I do sense that the social cohesion, social solidarity, is significantly reduced if there is no common agreement on a myth. Um, right? So this goes back to Hannah Arendt's argument, right? The origins of totalitarianism. But why is it that, like the supposedly like liberal, democratic, educated, Weimar Germans, why would they just, chuck out those, you could say, civilizational markers and throw themselves to Hitler's arms? Um, And it seems to me that, so her argument is a purely Durkheimian one, right? Where it's like, there's no, you could say, well, it's not just common story, but it's also like common organization, really, right? Like for instance, like the people that were in trade unions, for instance, they were very unlikely to vote for the Nazi party, right? But the people that were sort of like,
Complicated. Nazis had very high. They had surprisingly high support from unions. There's actually a good book, Origins of Evil, on this. There were unions in the 1930s that were Nazi aligned. Unlike today, where there's no unions that would ever align with any, recognizable right of center cause. It was much less polarized along economic dimensions back then. And that was why the Nazis had all the socialist stuff on their platform.
yeah, but isn't it the case that you would be more likely to support the Nazis if you had no affiliations, let's say with a union or any kind, or even with church, right? So,
Yes.
um,
Well, the religious effect is a big deal. The religious effect is the hardest core of the Nazis were not were less involved with regular church. So Catholics would vote for the Catholic Party. Although even there, it's like a puzzle because Lutherans were more likely to vote for Nazis, and people theorized. I don't want to say something that's wrong, so there's a reason for that. That's kind of accepted in the literature involving Lutherans being a little bit more religious and then not having their own party. But one hypothesis is that non-Catholic Christians, on average, were less attached to the church. And so, like you're saying, that the Nazism could be a source of social solidarity. I think that's where you're going with this. Was that believe in this kind of totalizing ideology was a social force that could satisfy people's need for solidarity.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and so I mean, if you uh look at the, I don't know, the social media channels of QAnon, which was, really active around like January 6th, right?
Those
You
accounts are
know,
still around. You can still find them.
yeah, yeah. I mean, so I mean, you could say, I mean, okay, they share, crazy narratives about, the globalist cabal, and like, cannibals were killing children and whatever. I mean, so I mean, it was in some sense, I mean, the narratives shared over there, I mean, they are, far removed from facts and from reality. Um, but it seems to me that from the social psychology standpoint, well, why is it that you would accept and embrace these narratives? It's not so much because, in your heart you believe them to be true, but rather that you were signaling to the other, QAnon, to the other social media members, and to the other, I guess, rioters on Capitol Hill, for those who showed up, that you were part of the same club, that you were part of the same team, that you were working towards something that you thought to be meaningful, right? Which is, to prevent, whatever, Joe Biden from taking office.
Yeah, the
Um,
globalists.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, so this idea of like having to be, wanting to be a group member, I think, um, that is very important, and that's why, I mean, is it the simple argument of like dismissing, I think Trump voters, or dismissing Nazi voters. I think that's, certainly not the right path. I mean, it's definitely, um, I mean, from a sociology perspective, I mean, it's definitely bad sociology, right? I think that, I mean, you want to not defend, you could say, the right wing ideology. I mean, but you want to point out, well, what is it that is causing people to embrace right wing ideologies? And I think it's definitely connected with, wanting to be part of a social group, right?
Yeah, the quest for community, a very old literature. Um, I guess I wanted to say that I'm very persuaded by the point about Durkheim that with the ongoing atomization, which I think is a process that actually still hasn't stopped. I think it's just been ongoing. It is like I think he really nailed the trend of the 20th century. and he nailed it fairly soon. Like, maybe he could have gone back to 1600 and said that was going on, but I feel that that's something that really hasn't reversed. I think there's many things that are explained by this kind of disintegration of norms, of community institutions, of things that don't serve some obvious function in the society from like a materialistic perspective. I also want to agree with your interpretation of conspiracies that I think the vast majority of conspiracies are a way for people to bond over the fact that they don't feel integrated into the mainstream of society in some way. And so the idea that there's someone from the future posting to 4chan, giving them kind of a mission and a way of feeling heroic, um, stopping pedophiles, the ultimate evil. I think that basically that's a very legitimate interpretation of what's going on with the Q people. And in general, I think that many conspiracy theories can be explained in this way. I just agree wholeheartedly. On the other hand, I think as well, there's something to be said about the role of like defrag of decentralization and the explosion of different conspiracies that are out there. Like I feel like if you go back to the 1960s, the first conspiracy theory to break into the mainstream is what do you think I'm going to say?
Is it about Kennedy assassination?
Got to be the Kennedy assassination, right? That's got to be the first one where it becomes widely held among much of the public that the government is lying to you about. There's many details of this that don't make sense. And personally, I haven't looked into it, but what I've seen does raise questions at a minimum, and maybe it's not worth my time to get to the bottom of that or come to a well-formulated opinion on the subject. But I would say that when we look at from then to here, the conspiracy theories have become so much more variegated. I mean, now we have UFOs, we have Q, we have Joe Biden, we have the lizards. These are all kind of ongoing, right? Since at least the 1980s. UFOs is totally new. I mean, totally a phenomenon of the 70s and 80s. Lizards, the Q stuff is the more recent. The pantheon just keeps exploding, and I think that you have this trend of atomization, and maybe even that's going to lead to like conspiracy theories that are not even held by a million people, but that are held by groups of like 20 or 30. Like, okay, we all believe this. Like there's one conspiracy theory that the internet is mostly robots. It's called dead internet, which I think I'm very intrigued by. And the idea is that there's actually very few people who are like on any given website. I don't think it's true, of course, it's ridiculous, but there's an interesting idea that most of the people you interact with are robots who are kind of, or at least the accounts you interact with, because most accounts you interact with, you don't really know them in real life. You don't really know who they are. So there's like a very, very superficial plausibility um, to that. But uh, but it is fascinating that they've actually exploded in the last few I would say 50 or 60 years. And I think a lot of it's not just the social solidarity, but I think a lot it's media, that the media environment's changed. So every kooky idea you have, you could put it out there. And there's people who are going to be kind of, I think, powerfully affected by those narratives. Like, for instance, have you ever heard of Slender Man?
No. Uh,
It's a modern urban myth, and it's the idea that there's this ghostly person who's very slender who will show up in your dreams and he's goes after children or whatever. And okay, it's someone posted on this in a forum, and then it becomes a copy pasta, and it shows up all over the place. There are two girls who killed their friend in Wisconsin because they said Slenderman told them to do it. And I think that we're going to be just seeing more and more of this stuff where there's increasingly niche conspiracies that are cited as motivations. And it's kind of unclear as a social theorist, do you take that at face value? Or is it the media itself even? Like is it even Q that's leading to this? Or is it the fact that there's these underlying phenomena and Q is like the rationalization or the story that we can tell that helps make sense of our own behavior? I think it's an open question.
yeah, I do think that there is a group of people that is much more susceptible to conspiracy theories. And I think it, and I do think the presumption has to be that their personal lives is messed up in some way, right? So, I mean, is it about, alcohol abuse? Is it about having an argument with your spouse or whatever? I mean, or losing your job, like the job tenure instability. So, I do think that something has to be messed up, and then you're much more likely to be sucked into it. Now, I mean, of course, I'm not denying that could perfectly healthy people who have healthy, good relationships with other people and exercise regularly, have a good diet, blah, blah, blah. I mean, could they also be inadvertently be sucked into it? Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't deny that possibility, but it's really, I think, I hope I can make a convincing statistical argument about this. I mean, of course, I have
So
not
on
seen the
average, like
studies.
you think the average case is somebody who somehow messed up in some way, and then the conspiracy gives them some kind of
Uh,
succor.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's basically about something that keeps them engaged, and they think that they found a cause that is meaningful and that gets them to a desirable objective. But certainly, I mean, yeah, social media is very powerful. I mean, I saw this graph, and I did not read the study that was behind that graph. But it was about how people find romantic partners, right? And I think 60%, 60+%, maybe 65 now is like is online, right? And it used to be the most common one. I think is usually friendship introduction. So you get invited to a party by your friend, and then you meet other people in that way, and that's usually
Market matching.
yeah, kind of like matching, but sort of inadvertently, and then I mean, of course, like family matching. I mean, that's how it was done for many generations in my family. Um, yeah, so those were kind of common, or like went to high school together, right? That sort of thing. But today it seems like if like you would the default expectation is you know if both sides did not swipe right on that app, then well then we won't even consider it, right? And yeah, so it's a very different norm and expectation. And Yeah, and I was wondering, I mean, maybe it is a little bit, I mean, and it has certainly its benefits, right? I mean, this idea that, well, okay, you can choose a large number of people that otherwise, you would not come across. Um, but yeah, having too many choices, I think that also appears to be quite, unhealthy in a way, because it reduces the chances of settling down totally, and the fear of missing out, right? I mean, this whole uh, concept of FOMO, I think, is really, I suppose, like a post-social media kind of phenomenon. Um, and Yeah, so I think there's certainly benefits. I mean, certainly increasing conveniences that the choice is giving. Um, but I do agree with the Herbert Simon argument about satisficing, right? I mean, at some point, if you have too many choices, you have to sacrifice a lot because of decision fatigue, and thereby having too many choices is not, I mean, it certainly has its costs as well. Um, and yet at the same time, I mean, nobody could imagine turning back the clock, right? I mean, like, would anybody, for instance, ever go back to this old model of, like, put down your phone and go out and meet people, right? I mean, that sort of um old model.
Well,
I
there's
mean,
matchmaking services. There are many dating websites that are experimenting with using machine learning or like having it so that a friend needs to vouch for you. Even Tinder itself, I haven't been on in years and years and years. But my understanding is that basically now they charge, inordinate amounts of money to, like, okay, I saw a meme where someone was like, oh, someone listed a requirement for height, and now you can pay money to get around the height requirement. So I think a lot of that has become totally extractive. And so people are seeking ways that are more traditional, but get some of the advantages of technology. Like, for instance, you want a friend to vouch for them, or someone in your social network that would say, okay, he's a good guy, or she's a good girl, something like that. Um, I think we have even when I think about Hinge is something that's designed to reveal much more information than Tinder. And it's designed to be much more like dating focused than Tinder is, presumably because people are not satisfied with Tinder. And Bumble's another one that totally reverses the dynamics. And again, it's the same, trying to introduce these different mechanisms and designs to recover some aspects of the traditional dating scene, the benefits of that, while maintaining the advantages of the new technology. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that there's an increasing variety of dating technologies out there? I mean, that's my feeling, is that there's actually a lot more than there were in the past in some ways. But it's not. I agree. It's not like everyone's happy in their relationships and everyone's getting paired off sooner or something like that. So it raises questions. I mean, one question is you could raise, is this really what people wanted in the past? I mean, you could argue that what's happened now is human nature and what people's preferences are now much closer to being realized. And so this new equilibrium is something that everyone's happy with. But when I talk to younger people, I don't find that to be the case. I don't find that people in their early 20s are like super happy with the world of dating and super satisfied. I mean, what do you think about that? What
Yeah,
do you think about, for I guess first of all, the explosion in different types of apps, and then second of all, what do you think about like young people's response to it?
yeah. Well, I mean, it seems to me the way how you're narrating it, I mean, it actually fits with my assessment that actually it's gotten worse.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think
it-
most people would say it's gotten worse, but
yeah,
I was just curious. Do you think the apps are why? I'm not sure.
yeah. Well, I mean, again, it goes back to this, decision fatigue argument, right? I mean, it's like, okay, if you have too many choices, and they appear to be good, but then you have the fear of missing out, right? I mean, there's always this idea, okay, somebody better could come along versus, in the old days, I mean, if you said, you married, the girl down the road or from the same school, and, like, for instance, one interesting thing is that, so the more conservative cultures where you actually have, like, family-based matchmaking, you could say, well, people are less happy in the marriage because, there's no romantic attachment to at the beginning of the relationship.
Yeah, in theory.
Um, but then actually, I mean, in terms of the marriage stability, I mean, those tend to be the most stable ones. Because I mean, because effectively, I mean, because both partners are going into this relationship with a high degree of, awareness, and you could say tempered expectations.
My suspicion about what makes that work is that they're all embedded in a community structure that really punishes them if they get divorced.
Right. So even if they were, having arguments with each other every day, I mean, it's kind of like they have to make it work, to some extent. Yeah.
Because they would be disowned. I mean, the punish maybe not disowned, but the punishments for divorce would be severe. Whereas when you're in the Tinder world, it's like, hey, easy come, easy go. So there's more than one dimension. I mean, there's the decision fatigue, that's the initial decision, but there's also optionality after you've met someone. And the optionality for people in the traditional societies you're describing is fairly low. Versus
Yeah.
optionality, this is a problem as well. Like when I talk to younger women, especially, but younger guys too, there's a feeling that no one wants to invest in the relationship. Even once let's suppose they've overcome the decision fatigue and they've matched and they've met, there's a fear of like, okay, making something with this person and emotionally investing. That if you do that, you'll just be exploited and then they'll move on. Or if they find a better option, then they'll move on. And it's not necessarily, it's a separate concept, separate phenomena from decision fatigue. But what do you think about this?
Right. I mean, so there's a potential asymmetry of expectations, where maybe the one side is much more emotionally invested in the other person than the other partner. And yeah, I mean, now if so, it depends really how strong the asymmetry is, right? I mean, if it's if the asymmetry is very small, then maybe the the differences can be breached, can be overcome. But yeah, I mean, if the differences are huge, right? So I mean, if the one partner is really like still on the app, still swiping on the screen, then yeah, I think there's obviously no future, and actually, if even for the person that has the high level of emotional investment, I think probably the best advice would be to roll the dice again, right? To look for a new partner. But yeah, I mean, but these are you know incredibly difficult choices to make. And I think it has become more difficult by having too many choices. And I mean, and I think, I mean, so I mean, it goes back to an earlier point about, like, you know like, that you raised about, like, the mortality rates of younger and, let's say, middle-aged people. And I think it was a study by Haidt, I think Jonathan Haidt, a couple of years back. It was about mental health of young girls, and it has apparently deteriorated right around the time that social media and smartphones were introduced. Um, and it seems to me that this, like, decline in the mental health, it was tied to, I think, like, invidious comparisons that were done, usually using social media, right? So, okay, I don't look as cool as the other girls that I see up on my screen. Also, it seems to be that the opportunities for bullying has increased, right? That like, if all you see are basically just characters on the screen, you know, like, the language can be way more aggressive, right? Then, like, if I was sitting in front of you, I mean, the chances of it, blowing over into, like, a fight, an actual conflict, is actually quite low. Because there's this idea of, like, yeah, if you see somebody, then you treat them much nicer, right? And then if you don't see them, um, and so that could be certainly a big driver of, um, I suppose, unhappiness among the young. And then the other, and then the new factor that's been thrown in here, aside from whatever the crazy politics we have in this country, um, I do think that the climate change challenge is significantly bigger than a lot of the other challenges that we are observing. Um, and and therefore, I mean, I think especially younger people. I mean, I think if you're older, I mean, if you're like a boomer, I think you can dismiss the narrative about climate change somewhat.
Yeah, rationally dismiss it. Yeah.
Yeah, you can dismiss it because, I mean, you're probably going to be around for 10 years, maybe 20 years or so, in good health. So, you know, après mort le déluge, as I guess Louis the 14th used to say.
Hmm. And all the
And
boomers say that. They all know French.
yeah, yeah. And the and it's different. Yeah, I think for the younger generation, I think there's a very great sense of urgency. And I think, I mean, if you look, for instance, just the last, let's say, just the last 6 months of climate of just weather data, right? Um, it is. I mean, basically, I mean, so from what I saw like last week, they tallied up the 2023 weather, and we're already at I think 1.48 degrees Celsius for just last year, um, increase to pre-industrial average. And and you remember like 9 years ago, right? We had this Paris Accord where the government leaders, they were all telling us confidently that that if we follow this agreement, then the 1.5 C is not going to be breached. Um, and it's very clear at this point that this prediction didn't age well. Um, so yeah, so I do understand that the enormity of the climate challenge, which makes younger people much more alarmist uh, about the futures. Um, and um, and the big question I think is to what extent industrial civilization, right? Technology, the idea of progress, capitalism, markets, and so on and so forth, consumerism. I mean, it, does the program that we're running the society on, does it contain within it the solutions to these problems, right? So, that's to say, like if we dig out some more minerals with which we produce, millions more electric vehicles and solar panels and windmills, um, is that going to be enough to to stop you could say the pace of that you know changing climate?
Well, I find this interesting because it seems like the technology has always been out there to really reduce climate change, in the form of nuclear energy. I just think that some countries they just don't care that much. I think it's just not for almost everywhere outside of the OECD, let's say. So I think OECD doesn't include China. Let's see, does it? OECD, China.
I don't think so. Uh,
China and the OECD.
I do think that at this point that nuclear energy has to be pursued as a policy. There were in Europe they had these disputes effectively because I think the Germans were the ones that were going towards the shutdown of the nuclear plants, and then I think the French. Well, it was interesting because up until a few years ago, so it was after Fukushima, even the French kind of said, they were still getting, I think, like 50% of the electricity from nuclear.
A substantial fraction, yeah. More than
Um,
half.
and also, I mean, they have I mean, it's interesting. I mean, among the OECD, I mean, I think they have one of the lowest, um, like, carbon intensity per unit of electricity produced, right? Something like that. So, and so they were at the beginning. They said, well, okay, we wanted to keep it stable, or we didn't want to build new plants, nuclear plants. But now I think, I mean, especially after the Ukraine war, I think that's really what would tip the scales for sure. I think right now it's like I think even the French are completely bullish on the nuclear plant developments. Um, and and I think if you look at the global map, I would say India and China are the two places. I mean, of course, they're the most population heavy. I mean,
I mean,
they're.
I thought about those as countries, yeah, where even if they did nuclearize, they might have expanding emissions. But everywhere else, it seems like if you nuclearized, emissions would go down a lot. I mean, even things like cars, you could electrify your cars, you can electrify a lot more than you think. And so the only countries where I would expect basically the CO2 emissions to just keep going up, even with the ongoing nuclear boom, in theory, would be China, just because they're industrializing so quickly, still, and India because they're trying to industrialize.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. Yeah, I think that you see, even as they're building these nuclear plants, I mean, yeah, I mean, the coal consumption is still going up. I mean, I think right now there's an argument between, I guess, India and, the other rich countries in the world, as to, when to shutter the, the coal plants. And I mean, I think the Indian plan right now, I mean, maybe unless they revise it later on, is to keep building the coal plants until the, mid 2030s. And then they wanted to do the full phase out around 2070 or something like that. Which I mean, so now it's a big question. It's like, well, how much time do we really have? Look, the trouble is also that, like, nobody is saying that we're stopping industrial lifestyle, right? I mean, I still have a gasoline car, right? I mean, I still,
You
I have
buy a
fam,
Tesla.
yeah, I've a family in Europe, so I mean, of course, I'm flying over the Atlantic. So, I mean, in a way, I mean, we it's just like, I mean, of course, there's like a general unwillingness to give up, the lifestyle that we have. Uh, but then you see the irony is that, like, even if, let's say, if you went to, like, the most primitive lifestyle, right, which is minimizing electric consumption the most, um first of all, I mean, there's like the social conflict issue, right? Where, I mean, you can see, like, a lot of the European countries, you see farmers that are up in arms, right? I mean, I think in France, for instance, I mean, they were throwing feces at, like, the parliamentary building or
Yeah.
something. Because, I mean, basically, because the governments are going too fast. I mean, they're saying, well, okay, all these whatever pesticides and chemicals and whatever you're using, it's all increasing CO2 footprint too much, and so you have to get rid of that. So basically, I mean, you're trying to shutter an entire industry, right? And yeah, so first of all, I mean, so maybe the social conflicts are not going to be tolerable, to cut emissions too fast. And then even if you did cut them, I mean, like, is that going to be at a speed and scale that's enough to, you know to basically bend the curve on the warming? Um, I am quite interested in this idea of, like, geoengineering, right? Um, uh, which, I mean, again, is, I mean, not in the sense that I think it is that we have the tools right now to do it, but rather it's like another one of those, you know last minute, like, Hail Mary, kind of like, throw the basketball at the last second, right? And hopefully you can score another 3-pointer, right? That's kind of, it seems to me, uh, what this geoengineering idea is all about. Um, but I attended this one talk with Elizabeth Colbert, like an environmental journalist, and she was talking about this. I think in Iceland, they have they have these factories that absorb the CO2 from the atmosphere. It's kind of like a giant air filter. You can think of it this way. So, sucking in the air, and then extracting the CO2, and then releasing, like, a basically like a higher oxygen content back into the atmosphere. Um, it, it's it is quite expensive to do it. And Now, I mean, so there's not too much net CO2 generation because in Iceland they have a lot of like geothermal energy. So they, it's just, I guess, naturally powered. Um, but but the quantity of the CO2 that gets absorbed is really small, right? I mean, like for instance, I mean, if you say, okay, every hour we take out the equivalent of like 10 airplanes, right? Of diesel emissions, um, kerosene emissions. But you have like, I don't know, over 10,000 airplanes at any moment flying in the sky, right? Things like that. So, um, I don't know. So geoengineering. So at the moment, not highly promising. Um, but I'm like, why the hell not? I mean, we'd have to try something. We'd have to throw something up against the wall and see whether it works. But I certainly agree with you. I mean, I think that nuclear plants, it would probably be the way to go. I mean, at least for now. I mean, I'm still concerned about the future where it's like, I mean, does Fukushima happen again? Does Chernobyl happen again? Are we able to do the waste storage safely? So I mean, there are certain issues that uh, I don't think are very trivial. And I mean, for instance, like the Ukraine war, I mean, also coincided with the same year where a lot of the French nuclear facilities were shutting down for temporarily for maintenance. So actually, the French at that time they had to import a lot of electricity from Germany and other countries. Um, so there's already, it tells you about the lack of reliability. I had a conversation with an engineer from Princeton, and he was saying, I mean, he very much liked natural gas, much more than nuclear. Even though gas, I mean, of course, it has CO2 in it. But I guess the idea is about the flexibility, right? So you have, let's say, you have like these get gas tanks that are attached um, to this, I guess, propellers. Um, and basically, let's say, if the wind doesn't blow or there's no sun shining, so the panels are not getting anything, um, you can just burn some gas, and then that turns on the turbine, and then and then you have electricity right away, right? So you can just search the supply right away. Um, Versus, I mean, with the nuclear energy, I mean, it's like you with these chemical reactions. I mean, you produce a steady supply of electricity, right? So you mean so basically, I mean, you have to be able to use up the electricity. And I mean, the issue is like, I mean, okay, let's say if it's very sunny, if it's very windy, so you already have an oversupply from the renewables, and then you have a stable high supply with the nuclear plants. So I mean, if you have maybe if you can sell it to neighboring countries, I mean, maybe it works like that. But yeah, so there are definitely kinks that you'd have to worry about if you do
Well, so the
um,
problem you're talking about is called load balancing.
load balancing. That's right.
And my understanding is that load balancing is economically, at least, kind of a solved problem because you have compute and you have Bitcoin. And so whenever you have excess electricity, you can use that to sell, literally server space and then Bitcoin. And so that doesn't exist everywhere in the grid, but that's I thought, a clever hypothesized solution.
To do to do more Bitcoin mining. Okay,
Yeah, well, when you have too much electricity, then the relative price of Bitcoin goes down. It's cheaper to mine Bitcoin, and then you mine Bitcoin, and then you sell the Bitcoin as long as it's economical. And then basically, but it doesn't have to be Bitcoin. It could be just like powering AI systems even. It's the same issue. So you free up more like anything that's like relies on having a lot of electricity, computation is going to use up a lot of electricity. You don't have to do all the computations at the same time. You can do some computations in the beginning, in the morning, like actually a lot of computations are not especially time sensitive. And so maybe you only do them at night when all the factories are shut down. And AI could very well be like that, where you have some AI problems and you just run them all at night, and that's the efficient way to do it. I think of the load balancing problem as kind of at this point,
It's a luxury
relatively
problem.
solved. It's not clear that this is like in some teleological sense, like efficient. Like, is that really where we want to be going as a society? You have to believe in crypto. You have to believe in AI. You have to believe that there's some the productive alternative use for this electricity. But that particular problem, I think of as like basically from a like social policy perspective, okay, you have extra electricity, it's semi-efficient, okay, you could solve it. Now, you still might not want to build nuclear if it's just way too much, and you're just always going to be running crypto that you think of as in some sense like socially inefficient, right? But but if your problem is only like at nighttime you're producing too much electricity, or you're producing too much electricity when it's windy and the sun is out, then this could be a solution. I think similarly, like the idea, like your friend, the engineer, I think he was saying that he likes gas because gas pairs better with the renewables. So
Yeah,
whenever
completely.
the
Definitely.
renewables are no longer working, then you turn the gas on. And I think that's an interesting idea.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because with the gas, I mean, as long as you got the gas tanks, right? I mean, you can
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a
just
good point. I mean, Iceland,
turn
I can
them on.
imagine small places like Iceland doing that. Or let's see, does Iceland have a nuclear power plant? I suspect not.
No, I mean,
And I think it's just
Iceland is
well,
geothermal, right? I think almost
yeah,
all
it's
the
geothermal.
energy
It's also just too
is
small for
geothermal.
it to be worth it. I mean, France has cities that are like, Paris, I think is like something like 10 million people plus. So let's see, Paris population. Actually, the inner Paris is only 2 million, but surely greater Paris has to be more because New York City core is only 8 million. Why does it say, does Paris have 10 million population? Da, da, da,
Par
da.
yeah.
Well, it's actually small, but I guess with 2 million, it's still more worth it to have nuclear power than with only 300,000 like they have in Iceland. So you need some level of population density. I
Well,
guess my other point about climate change is that I think human geography is going to solve it. I just think like large parts of the world will become less habitable, some underwater, the Maldives, for instance, and then people will just leave. And the real problems with climate change are in that sense so more likely to be social than anything else, like on the average trajectory.
so right now, I mean, I think the political right in this country is going nuts over, illegal immigration. And I mean, it is true. Like, so in terms of the border apprehensions, I think we are at like 3x or 4x and what we were like before the pandemic, I guess.
Is
Um,
illegal immigration rates are extremely high right now, I would say.
yeah, that's right. And I mean, so I do understand again going back to this like social solidarity framework that if you try to absorb a large number of migrants all at the same time, I mean, it's going to undermine the social cohesion, the social support for it. And so, I mean, I was thinking about like the case of Canada, for instance. I mean, Canada has always been cited as, one of the most successful immigration countries, taking in people from overseas. And a lot of it has to do with this, like, uh, system of like points, right? Where it's like they can select the so-called desirable migrants, which I mean, in Europe, you cannot do because you have land borders with like Turkey and the Middle East and countries that are much poorer than Europe. Um, so you can't really block a lot of the migrants. But in Canada you can do it. Because basically the U.S. is the only like land border. Um, and but even in Canada, I mean, there's a lot of pushback against immigration. Basically because the cost of living. I mean, if you look at housing, I mean, so some of the housing prices are, of course, being inflated because you have like rich Chinese people or Saudi sheikhs that are buying up properties in the big cities, mostly is speculative value, not for living in it. Um, but I think some of it is also because i- because if you bring in so many migrants, even if they're legal, right, the legal permanent migrants, permanent residents, um, and and you increase the housing stock by a much smaller fraction, at a much smaller rate than you bring in the new people. Um, yeah, I mean, you're gonna have basically have unaffordable housing, and I think that's kind of the situation where they're in. And all of the Anglo-Saxon countries are struggling. I mean, if you look in Australia, US, UK, Canada, I mean, they're all struggling regarding the, doing enough housing construction. At least at the pace at which, the immigration is coming in. And I think that kind of situation, I mean, I think it does create significant amount of popular backlash. And then, I mean, of course, and then the only people who are then unreservedly pro-migrant, I think, are kind of like the upper middle class.
Well, and homeowners, right? If you're a current
Homeowners.
homeowner or a professor, honestly, as a professor, that's something where the future supply of students has to come from somewhere, and it's not coming from Americans. So there is a problem with that as well, where I think academics and I think homeowners really do support increased immigration, really as much as you can go, like as far towards open borders as you can go, I would say, because it's in their material interest. I mean, it just makes a lot of sense. Um, and I think that you also point out that there's this practical problem. It doesn't make any sense. So how are they going to like increase immigration and not build any more housing in Canada? I mean, it's a recipe for economic disaster, and the political consequences. Like, I'm impressed by the fact that they haven't already had some kind of vote or revolt or something like that. Because if you drive people out of their homes, they go ballistic. I don't know what they're going to do about that. It doesn't make any sense. Um,
Yeah, I mean, of
yeah.
course, like the older generation. I mean, maybe the boomers are fine because I mean they purchased maybe the housing a long while ago.
Yeah, when it was cheaper. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, but I guess like if you are, let's say, like a younger millennial or like a Gen Z, and you basically you still live with mom and dad basically because you just can't afford your own place effectively, and I think that's where a lot of the bubbled up tension probably is coming in. Right? I mean, it's not so much. I mean, perhaps like I mean, there's also maybe rising homelessness. I mean, that could also be an issue. But certainly, I mean, the phenomenon of like you know, yeah, not being able to become an adult, moving out
Yeah,
of
and
your
afford
parents'
your own
house.
house. I think that's a very big
Um,
deal. Um, and it's a totally solvable problem, and you can build more housing. It's not like rocket science to construct new housing stock, but a lot of places are zoned to be single family. And, if you turn them all into duplexes, two, three, four family homes, or brownstones or something like that in Brooklyn, you could really, I think, solve a lot of the housing problems in the country, but people won't accept it and they have local control. It's a major problem. I mean, my gut feeling about this is that the biggest problem is actually in the city. Because in the city, that's where the most people want to live usually. But if you go to Brooklyn or many major cities in the US, you'll encounter huge neighborhoods where nothing goes greater than 2 or 3 stories. I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? Because there's so much economic activity next door. And my own feeling about this is that it's a major problem for the whole country what to do about big urban areas not being accommodating to kind of newcomers. Um, and I think actually a lot of the immigration problems that people are having would go away if the housing stock problem were fixed. I think a lot fewer people would be politically animated by that if the housing stock was available to accommodate everyone. But in New York as well, there was reports by Mayor Adams that they're storing all these people in like hotels and things like that. And I'd heard someone told me that they were hotels that were formerly used by veterans. I mean, this is terrible optics. when you kick out veterans and you bring in undocumented immigrants for puzzling reasons. And then the mayor himself says, please stop sending undocumented immigrants here. We're having problems with the social safety net and the existing systems. I don't actually understand the Democratic Party strategy in terms of what they're trying to do overall. I'm actually puzzled by it.
Well, I think the Democrats, yeah, I mean, they brought themselves in a very bad predicament because, so like, so the narrative about sanctuary cities, right? I mean, it emerged in the Trump era, right? So when Trump was saying, well, we should build the wall, we should keep our documented, blah blah. And then you have the northern cities, I mean, like New York and Chicago and others, and they were like, well, we are sanctuary cities. Now, at that point, I mean, during the Trump era, I mean, there were not so many migrants, so I think it was probably still okay. But now in
And
the
maybe a
Biden,
virtue signal. Yeah,
yeah,
it
I
was
mean,
like
it was
it was signaling virtue without paying the cost, you could
without
say.
paying the cost, and then the Biden administration, because so it was Biden. I mean, well, he pays lip service to border security, but I don't think he cares that much about it, or it's not that high of a priority. Especially because he thought that he was elected as being the anti-Trump, that he has to be more on, I think, more on the pro-migrant side of things. And then the issue is, okay, so then in Texas, I mean, the Republican states, so they take in more of the migrants. They have to because they're the border states. And then they say, okay, now we're going to test them, the virtue signaling of these northern cities. And we're just going to send them on a one-way ticket, with airplanes, with buses, Greyhound buses, and so forth. And we send them up to the north and see what they say about it. And now it's interesting because now the Democrats, I mean, they don't really have a good counter argument because because either they have to say, well, okay, never mind, we're not we're not interested in being sanctuary city anymore, in which case they would be revealed as hypocrites, or they have to say, no, keep coming, and we welcome the migrants, but by the way, we're going to have to cut down library services, which is exactly what's happening in New York City, right? Um, yeah, so the Democrats, I think they brought themselves in a very uncomfortable situation. And so on the housing front, I think you're right that improving, like increasing the housing stock, changing the zoning laws, I think would make a big difference. I mean, like even in Baltimore downtown here, we're talking three-story buildings. Like when I go back to Vienna, I mean, in the downtown area, we go up 6 to 7 floors per building, like apartment buildings. And it seems to me that this is a perfect population density because the street level is not overcrowded, so it's not like Manhattan, right? Or like downtown Seoul or Tokyo. Um, but it's still worthwhile to invest in like things like public transit, like trams, trolleys, subways. I mean, you need to have a certain population density. I mean, we're not building a lot of public transit systems, in large part because of suburbanization, effectively, right? It's not profitable to build these lines. So yeah, so you can build in a much more compact way just by changing up the zoning laws. I think that would make a huge difference. Um, but then I think so on this argument of like the border security. I mean, should there be border funding? Um, Ultimately, yes. I mean, because again, if you're concerned about having the right amount of social cohesion, right? And that's certainly not. It doesn't necessitate zero migration. I don't think that's the right path either. But certainly like a level that's like tolerable, right? Where let's say you add, I don't know, 1% of the country's size every year or something like that, right? That could be tolerable, and then you can of course plan all of the necessary infrastructure, the number of schools, the hospitals, the housing, the public transit that you need. in order to accommodate the increases in population. Um, but then you see, but then again, but we started talking about it because of the climate issue, right? So if like, I mean, if you have like temperatures that are even now or within the next 5 to 10 years, completely unsustainable. I mean, in I guess let's call them equatorial regions. Um, it's like then it also appears to me that the pressure towards migration into the you could say the northern hemisphere, well, that pressure is only expected to increase further and further, right? Um, so I'm not sure whether like legislative fixes on migration limits are possible or feasible. Um, you know, maybe we do have to adjust our social systems, even at the cost of like threatened social cohesion. Right? You know, uh, we have to get ready for a massive increase in migration. Um, I don't know how much you're into this like world systems theory argument, right? Where basically the rich countries in the world are holding down the poorer countries and squeezing you know primary commodities resources out of them, and then basically selling them back high value added stuff, which means that those countries get indebted, and they cannot invest in their infrastructure, the human capital, and so on and so forth. um and so I mean, in a way, I mean, so as long as you're kind of through this international financial system, I mean, if you're maintaining extreme differences, wealth and poverty, I mean, I think I mean, a simple valve to kind of fix it would be migration, right? Yeah,
Well, I think for climate change, it's the most natural solution, right? Where people, okay, so Panama becomes less habitable, Guatemala becomes less habitable, and then the people move. I'm also a little bit more sanguine about the some of the migration because fertility rates in, for instance, Mexico are now quite low. I mean, I think they're just above replacement. You can check
yeah,
Mexican fertility rate.
yeah, I think
So
it's
it's at
about true, right?
1.9. So what that means
1.9.
is basically that migration, I think, can't be a very large problem. I mean, the way that demographers think about migration is that there's different models. I mean, demographers think about migration as basically a function of fertility, and then you just use that to predict. And then there's random huge shocks that like mess up your models. But in regular times, it's a function of fertility from 30 years ago or 20 years ago. And if you look at Latin America, all over, it's below replacement. I think there's only two countries that are above replacement. So I actually think if we go flash forward to 2050, I don't think immigration will be considered a social problem in the way it is today, because I think the overall level is going to be much lower.
Yeah. So one statistic that I just saw like this morning in social media, I think that the number of Chinese nationals apprehended at the U.S. Mexico border last year was 30,000 people. And
A
I think
lot.
the year before it was like 1 or 2,000. So I mean, so you remember when Xi Jinping ended like the zero COVID policy, right? Where the economy is going to open up and we're going to attract foreign capital come back in, tourists, and so on and so forth. Now the problem is, I mean, it also coincides with the U.S. is ratcheting up, the Cold War pressure on China. So I think like the sanctions on the semiconductors, right, not sharing the most recent technology, that certainly has an impact, like not allowing U.S. citizens to work on technology sensitive products in China. Um, that's part of that, and also there was a lot of like anti-business crackdown by the CCP, Communist Party, that certainly sent a chill down the business environment over there. Um, and also the demographics. I mean, like, I saw the figures come out like 2 days ago. I think 2023 fertility was 0.88, right? I mean, and I think last year it was like 1.07, 1.07. Um, so it's again like another sharp drop, right? Even within just 1 year. Um, so I mean, I mean, it's effectively, I mean, there is, yeah. So in a lot of places, things can go wrong, and I just listening to this podcast with Tyler Cowen, which I mean, he's a real America optimist economist, and he just said, yeah, I mean, if you look at all of the countries in the world, and you look at all of the problems and challenges, and the asset column, he thinks that the U.S. is relatively the best off, because I mean, even with, I mean, the uncertainties regarding the election this year, um, there's some macro level indicators that are still positive. So like take for instance the energy prices, right? So after Ukraine war started, skyrockets in Europe, and then it went down again. Skyrockets in Asia, then also went down. And in North America, actually, the gas prices it also increased, but it was just like a slight bump. Um, because because basically, I mean, the natural resources like the gas is drawn out of this country, right? It doesn't rely on like foreign suppliers. Um, so yeah, I do think there's certain advantages that the U.S. has, um, uh, compared to some of the other countries. Um, uh, but I don't know. I mean, do you share that assessment? I mean, about some of the advantages that the U.S. has compared to other countries in the
Well,
global
I
system? I
feel
don't
that
know.
the social democratic model in Europe is now failing to generate income gains. I don't think it's sustainable. I think they're going to need to reform. And I mean, I include Germany, I include I include France in that. If you look at the income levels, they've been so low since the Great Recession. And you can argue that that's from austerity, or you can argue that because taxes are too high or something, but the US is really blown them away. And the UK has been one of the most disappointing countries in terms of recovery. And Brexit may be a part of that. We can argue about that. It could be also, I mean, they've had a remarkable, again, amount of immigration without any housing liberalization. Just seems like a recipe for disaster. Um,
For the Brits, I mean, I know the productivity statistics that
Also very bad.
yeah, it stopped rising at about 2010, like right when the conservative government came in. And that's why, I mean, if you listen to like Keir Starmer, who's probably going to win the election, I mean, almost full certainty at this point. I mean, that's kind of like the main mantra. I mean, that the Labour Party is going to try to increase revive productivity. I mean, how that's going to be done, I'm not sure. I mean, I think he talks about like green energy investments, which, but I mean, but a lot of countries have been talking about it for many years, right? So I'm not sure whether that's going to be enough to make a marginal difference. Certainly closer relation integration with the EU again. I think that would probably help but not hurt. Though I mean, as you said, I mean the other EU countries are struggling too
No,
to
I
grow.
just think the whole model is not working. I think that Norway, Denmark, those countries also have very liberalized product markets. They have other aspects of liberalism that they've adopted from the US, and I just think those aspects have been very successful compared to the more planned system in Germany. I mean, Germany in manufacturing, I think, has really failed to keep up with China. I don't know that they should copy China, but the idea that we're going to have this sectoral advantage and we're going to maintain it, I don't know if that has panned out in the last 5, 6 years. Um, I have some comments on China. These are my own thoughts. They're not found in any literature, which is that what China had in 2010, this kind of whole process democracy, where the decisions were made by the oligarchy and the Communist Party, I actually think that was quite threatening to the US model. I think that it had many achievements under its belt. And when I look at what's happened since then, it seems like it's collapsed into a regular dictatorship. And I don't think that regular dictatorships are any threat to the US's version of democracy. And so I don't know if China can go back at this point. It could be that there's just a flaw in this kind of oligarchical, the Communist Party system, making a council and making decisions where it always collapses and becomes a dictatorship, like that happened in the Soviet Union. They had the council that was making a decision, and eventually it just became Stalin. And when I look at China, they had this big council that was making a decision. The premier served for, well, they had some like norm of 7 years, long terms, but not forever, and then it collapsed and became Xi Jinping indefinitely. And I don't know if the performance of China under Xi Jinping has improved in any way. It seems like it's simply not a threat to the US model. I think that what they had in 2010 actually could be threatening to the US model of governance and things like that, where they have this kind of AI system, everyone's under surveillance. They're always doing surveys to kind of be responsive to people's needs, basically, but it's still a dictatorship. You can't really challenge the state. They had much higher levels of economic growth back then. Um, so, what are dictators for? My interpretation of what dictators are for, why do you want to centralize power? You want to centralize power when you're going to war. And so, I guess my prediction is it's very conditional, but my prediction is that if China ever takes Taiwan, Xi Jinping will be gone within 5 years because of reaction within the Communist Party itself. That's my prediction. Is that there are probably many people within the Communist Party of China who are willing to maybe look the other way. I mean, hey, look, if I'm applying for a job in China, we're going to delete this video, an academic job or something. But while before that, there are probably many people in China within the Communist Party. I met people in the Communist Party. I had friendly relations, years ago. I was in public policy and I was at the Treasury for a minute, and we would talk and we would have lunch in 2015 and we would compare our countries. And there has been such a sea change in difference. I don't meet anyone now from China who speaks favorably of their government or with any pride in their achievements or things like that. There are achievements under Xi Jinping for sure, but it's not like the rate of change that it was 10 years ago. And I think for many people, China as an inspiration in development has really faded. But dictators can still be useful. They can be useful when you need a national will to go to war. And I suspect that your modal, influential, intelligent Chinese Communist Party member is willing to, let's say not at the high level where they're in direct competition, but, not at the bottom as well. The middle rank is okay with it because they expect to go to war with Taiwan and they see someone like Xi Jinping as like the kind of leader that can get them through it, who's like gritty and has some kind of will. I think that that's what they have as their mental model. And so my prediction is that if they do take Taiwan successfully, this will be that Xi Jinping's days are numbered after that. I see it as very similar to Bibi Netanyahu, where once the war footing ends, his own power base will disintegrate. He has to whip the country up into this kind of fear and antagonism towards the US and have a total control over the media environment and this perception of wide competition. And that's the only way that this kind of dictatorship can be sustained. I just cannot see him being in power after that. So, from Xi Jinping's perspective, if I were him and I were rational, I would always want to be on a war footing towards Taiwan, get as close to the line as possible, but never go to war actually. That's my prediction about foreign policy and the US Chinese relations. I don't think China will ever surpass the US in GDP if the current trends continue.
Yeah, that's where, I mean, I think, raising the story of Putin is quite instructive here, right? Because so if you remember, during that Beijing Winter Olympics, right, just like 3 weeks before the Ukraine war started, when Xi Jinping invited Putin to come to Beijing, and Xi was declaring the eternal friendship between Russia and China, and that was basically a um I guess, the permission that Xi Jinping gave to Putin to invade Ukraine. And obviously, I mean, she was interested in testing the resolve that the Western countries, especially the United States, has towards basically defending, Europe against Russian aggression. And right now, I mean, look, I mean, we are kind of in an in between indecisive phase, right? Where basically, I mean, the Biden administration, I think they want to, I think they want to continue the fight in Ukraine. Um, Most of the congressional leadership, I think, in both parties, Democrat, Republican, I think they also want to continue the war funding, but I think also that like the new speaker, the Johnson, I think because he feels that pressure from the MAGA faction, where it's like, okay, we have to get this border funding done, and then even if we get the border funding done, maybe we find another excuse to not fund Ukraine because Ukraine is too far away from the U.S. and we don't care. So therefore, I think I do think that in terms of like this U.S. assertion within the global political sphere, I do think it is in doubt somewhat, where it's like if Xi Jinping observes that Ukraine fails in some manner because of a lack of U.S. support, I mean, not only would there be a threat to the European countries regarding further aggressions by Putin, um, but also I think that maybe it does seal the fate of Taiwan to some extent. And and because I mean I just listened to a podcast yesterday with Niall Ferguson, a historian, and he kind of compares the Taiwan Straits issue with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but now with the roles being reversed. Now the Soviets is are the Americans, right? And the Chinese are the Americans back in the 60s, where basically the Chinese resolve to take Taiwan is much greater than the U.S. resolve to cross the Pacific Ocean and protect Taiwan, right? So I don't know. I mean, the immediate future. I mean, that doesn't look too good. I do hope that your interpretation of the events of Xi Jinping's thinking is correct to basically um, stop short of an invasion. To basically just basically, I mean, you wave the flag, right? The nationalistic flag. You give the right speeches, whatever. Um, so you want to throw enough red meat to the base without necessarily going all in. Um, and okay, so how do you interpret this APEC summit, which was a couple of months ago? I mean, where the Americans and the Chinese said, well, okay, we have to open up some diplomatic military channels. Maybe there's some issues on climate or even on technology. We can work together again. Um, was it all to, you know, blow some smoke on the screen? Or is there perhaps a realization in Beijing that, you know, like like if we don't want to accelerate our stagnation and decline, you know, we have to reopen the channels with the US. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's too rosy
Yeah, I think it
of
is
a
too rosy.
description.
I think a country that's totally has opened their relations with the US would be, for instance, South Korea. And they have the same stagnation and decline problem as China if you're just talking about fertility rates. I want to go back a little bit. I see Putin and Xi as very different figures. Putin, if you look at when he took power in Russia, GDP has gone up something like what, 3-4 times since then, multiplied. Life expectancy of males has gone up by 10 years. I want to write an essay, Putin's Social Policy Triumph. It reminds me a lot of the Nazis, and not in a, I don't mean this as an invidious comparison. I mean this in the sense that Nazis were perceived as solving certain social problems in the society in Germany. They eliminated, for instance, all crime. They eliminated many economic problems, and many people were willing to fight to the death on the basis of Hitler's achievements from 1933 and even earlier than that, where they had taken power locally until the end, until 1945. They believed in that dream, but there were real material basis for that kind of belief. Putin, I see, is very, very similar to that. I think many Russians who are fighting now in Ukraine have horror stories from their parents under the liberalization, domination by the West, being bullied. They see that basically all the countries of the Western world that they thought of as their allies putting missiles and troops near their border against them and turning into enemies. I don't think, for instance, they necessarily perceive something like Finland joining NATO as catastrophic in the same way Ukraine joining NATO is catastrophic. And I think Putin has a wide base of support within Russia on the basis of those memories, of that historical memory. Xi Jinping doesn't have that. Xi Jinping came in when China was rising, and since then they've stagnated. I see his base of support being a certain faction of the Communist Party itself, and then rural people, to some extent, some nationalists. I see those as kind of the two bases of support for Xi Jinping within China. And the CCCP faction, let's say the median voter in the CCCP supports him only on the basis of the potential Taiwanese victory, in the same way that he was able to secure a victory in Hong Kong. That kind of thing is legitimizing for a state, but only for a few years. Even in a dictatorship, if you have a total military victory, I don't know that it sustains you for that long if you have some competitors, if you have competition within your own base. I mean, we think of Stalin. Stalin, after World War II, achieves total victory, and yet the system that he erected collapsed within 10 years of his death. And even then, he felt insecure after the war and had to do more felt that he had to do more purges, possibly correctly. We don't know. There's still not enough information about what was happening. And I see Xi Jinping as somebody whose power comes from the fact that they expect a dictator to be able to more easily win a military conflict and have total mobilization compared to the old, more oligarchical system, which could deliver the bread. And my perspective is that that oligarchical system in China was widely perceived as possibly a model for the world as solving social problems, was more exportable and therefore more dangerous to U.S. hegemony. Because what is U.S. hegemony about? It's about the idea of liberal democracy. It's about the idea that if you wear jeans, if you adopt markets, if you have the vote, your life will get better. You will prosper. And China's threat to the U.S. in that time was the perception that that was possible. But by going to this old dictatorship model, like something from the 1930s, where it's like one strong man and he has his henchmen underneath, I think that's not a survivable model in the long run. So I think even Putin would be threatened in the very long run. If he were to live to be 100, he'd be gone. But I think what Putin's base of support comes from is the historical memory of him seeming to revive Russia and put the reign of the oligarchs, predatory, mercantile oligarchs, to an end. In China, the oligarchs have a different reputation. The billionaires in China, Jack Ma, those are people who are thought of as providing an alternative model. And I find the case of Jack Ma very instructive because, as far as I can tell, Jack Ma, you know
Well,
Jack Ma, right?
he's neutralized, right? I mean,
Well,
his
but
assets
what's
were stripped, right?
fascinating about him is that he exhibited no signs of disloyalty to the Marxism and the Chinese Communist Party itself. But because the regime was so paranoid about any threats to its power, he was neutralized. Someone like Jack Ma cooperating with the CCCP in 2010, I think of that as a major threat to the US because the US relies on its billionaire class being cooperative with the central state. And China coming up with its own alternative, kind of twisted version of that, I see as kind of dangerous. And I mean dangerous in the sense of it's an alternative to liberal democracy that can spread. I can imagine African countries adopting it. I can imagine Russia becoming more like that kind of system. I can imagine other countries adopting something like that. I cannot imagine other countries saying, yeah, what we need is a big dictator who doesn't have any kind of natural organic base of support, who makes mistakes like the COVID zero mistake that would not have been made under the old oligarchical system. That's my maybe too nuanced perspective of it. I find no one shares that, but that's my interpretation of what's happened in China. And without the historical memory of Xi Jinping, solving all these social problems, I think that his base of support from like a popular perspective is just going to be quite limited. I could see him taking Taiwan. I could see him defeating the U.S. Navy outright through something, and they take Taiwan, and then he should make plans to retire after that. Because within the Communist Party itself, I expect that he would lose support. That's my interpretation, which is a very common pattern. Churchill achieved, wartime powers, sweeping majorities. And if he didn't like you, basically you would be put in jail. That was the way it was in 1944. You go to 1946, it's a different universe. That transition from war to peace and war mindset to peace mindset is not associated with long lives, political lives for strong leaders or people who have that normal stereotypical perception of being strong. What do you think about that? You're maybe the second only person I've ever talked to about this publicly.
I think that the thesis does make sense to some extent. I think that I mean, if you, certainly, I mean, I saw the graph in the Financial Times where the rise of China was really about the Hu Jintao era, right? So we're talking like this period from about so in 2000 when China joined the WTO, right? When it started to massively scale up the exports because the Western countries basically opened the borders. And up until about 2012, 13, and I think you're certainly right that maybe the authoritarian capitalistic model is could be a workable model, though it
Yeah,
should be.
I guess authoritarian capitalism in two words, I think is much more threatening to the US than what Xi Jinping is doing. The
And
centralization, and I think what should be scary for China and their prospects. And I say that with no, I wish them all success in terms of like prosperity and material abundance. Is that in some ways they progressed? They went from something that seemed to be working to what they're doing now, which has not generated high levels of economic growth, does not appear to have generated high levels of personal satisfaction or happiness. People are still leaving China, and Xi Jinping was a moderate within his party. The alternative to Xi Jinping was Bo Xilai, who wanted to go more in the Maoist direction. So there's a troubling pattern of what do you do when the two alternatives on offer are not so good. When you had three alternatives, you had an anonymous group of people who were like, "Oh, we should just copy the West." Okay, that's fine. I would actually think it's good. They would prosper, we would prosper. That would be the end of global conflict. They might even be dangerous in some sense, in the same way democracies sometimes bump heads with each other. Then you had Bo Xilai, who was representing the Maoist faction. Do you remember him?
yeah, of course, yeah, he was
Yeah.
the mayor of
And now he's
Chongqing.
in jail. He's done. And then Xi Jinping, my understanding is he was perceived as the more moderate faction, and what he's doing is essentially a regression. So all right, that's my
Yeah,
interjection, just to be clear.
the guy that appointed him was Jiang Zemin. He was a prior leader who was put in charge after I guess the 1989 Beijing protest. And yeah, so there was this belief, which I guess is misguided, that Xi Jinping would be a you could say a moderate who would be similar to somebody like Hu Jintao. I mean, who would be observing and respecting the party elders and also deferring to the norms that were set forth by Deng Xiaoping, which is to
Yeah, exactly.
which is only hold power for 2 terms and stuff. And
Exactly.
and I mean, actually, I mean, if you look at the biography of Xi Jinping, I mean, you might have guessed that he would be a pliant figure who would be a party loyalist, based on the way that he was treated by the party. I mean, so during the Cultural Revolution, so his father was Shi Jong-sun. He was another high-level party bigwig, and then he was sent to the countryside, where he had to do like manual labor and things like that. And it's quite interesting because some people, like, if they were punished like that, they would have bitterness, right? They would hate the party and they would have nothing to do with it. But actually, Xi Jinping's reaction was the opposite, right? I mean, he basically, his mindset was that he had to do everything to rehabilitate himself within the Communist Party. And the best way for him to do that is to basically be a loyal party soldier. And that's what, and that's the line, and that's the reputation that he fostered all throughout until he got to the top job. And only at that point, that's when he, let his the mask fall down, and once he started the purges based on the corruption, like the anti-corruption campaign, which was extremely popular. I mean, the masses were quite impressed by, swatting down the corrupt officials, who at that time, I mean, like, by definition, I think that many party officials are going to be corrupt because there's no rule of law, right? I mean, there's no independent judiciary that where bad officials could be consistently prosecuted, right? So I mean, kind of like the corruption is kind of built into a system where there's no rule of law, right? Um, and but then his decision to do selective crackdown, right? I mean, it wasn't the case that everybody below him, that was, you know, uh, that was corrupt was put in jail. Rather, I mean, it was a purge that was disproportionate towards the party opponents, which, and the most important one was Boshilai, as you mentioned.
Well, factional opponents, because they were all within the party, but factional opponents within the CCCP. And I also wanted to say the other thing about the Chinese regime is the remarkable lack of creativity that they've exhibited. So when I read their industrial strategy, it just says, okay, we want to keep all the manufacturing in China, and we're not going to move to a post-industrial economy. That's very expensive. The US became post-industrial because it was very expensive to keep manufacturing in the US. So what China is doing is they're saying we're going to commit to a lower standard of living. It only makes sense if you're going to go to war. That's the only case in which you want to have all them, and the only case in which basically, and I think that if he goes to war, he destroys his own base of support. So I suspect one thing. Let me come up with a scenario in which he does go to war. He goes to war with Taiwan when he's, how old is he? Let's see.
I think he's about 70, right?
Bo Xilai
71.
age, or not Bo
Oh
Xilai,
no, Xi Jinping. Yeah,
Xi Jinping age.
I think he was born in
He's
53, right?
70.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so let's say that he gets to be 73 and he thinks I'm done. Then I think he wants to quit in 3 years. Then he should go to war with Taiwan because it cements his legacy within the party. And then he resigns and everyone says he's really great and smart and all that kind of thing. That's the only scenario in which I see him going to war with Taiwan. I see it as like 3 years or bust. He's not going to be doing it in his late 70s because I just think people don't do that in their older age. And I think that basically he's not going to do it right now because I think that he would be done and he expects to reign for another 5 years. I think he would be deposed if he did it right now. So I would put very low probability of invasion of Taiwan, even if Russia totally wins in Ukraine. They take Kiev, they take all of Ukraine. Not going to happen. I would be very impressed, surprised, and doubtful that they take Taiwan. I think that they don't have the gumption to do it. And I think every incentive that he has as a dictator who knows that his own base of support relies on this median person within the CCP, that would be it. So I think that the probability that he does it when he knows he's going to retire, that's when the probability of him going to war is actually highest. So if I were in the CIA, I'd be trying to figure out when does it seem like he will retire, based on history and things like that. If he plans to stay into his 80s, then the war just keeps getting pushed back. That's the only time it's rational. So that's my revised forecast. He may not even do it then if he doesn't think he can win, or if he thinks that it'll just be too costly. But if he does it right now, I think he would destroy his own base of support because with the one child policy, many of these families don't have that many children to lose, that many sons to lose in conflict is number one thing, and then the number two thing is it's not clear beyond his own personal thing if they would win. I mean, I'm not sure they would win a war with Taiwan. They'd have to blockade it. It would be long. It could be that the U.S. has some cool tricks up its sleeve too. So I'm very sanguine. And I'm also very sanguine about the conflict in Ukraine as well. Russia is not able to project power. I mean, if you look at Bakhmut, they had destroyed the hardest core of the Ukrainian army, just totally wiped out in Bakhmut by the Wagner group. And then what does Russia do? Russia says we're going to dissolve the Wagner group. They just have no political, no creativity. Many of these regimes have. I mean, if it were me and I were in charge and Wagner had just won, I would say double the size of Wagner, and then we should be go
Yeah,
and try to take
but there was a
Kharkiv.
Wagner coup, right? So
No, the Wagner
because there
coup
was a
happened because Putin had said we're going to dissolve the Wagner group and reintegrate it into the army, even after the spectacular success in Bakhmut. So again, a challenge with all these regimes, these dictator regimes, is they're very paranoid, and they don't allow for other people to rise because of their own competence and stature. I mean, it's a big problem with Xi Jinping. That's the story of Jacques Ma. We learned from this the regime is very paranoid and is not willing to tolerate plausible alternatives, and therefore is not willing to tolerate high levels of public competence. So for the Wagner
so
group,
there's a
yeah,
trade-off between loyalty and competence, right? So if you have like high competence, then there's potentially low loyalty, and that's actually more threatening to the regime.
absolutely.
So you'd want to have, yeah, I mean, ideally you have high competence, high loyalty, but more likely it's going to be high loyalty, low competence, right? Because the people who are most loyal tend to be people who are not creative.
Yeah,
Um,
and my feeling is that within democratic regimes, it's much weaker. That trade-off is much weaker because you have decentralized power, you have many domains in which you can have success. You have Elon Musk, you can be a capitalist success. You have the generals, might be more dubious, but successful in their own way. And basically having many of these kinds of domains, they're not really going to threaten the president in any way. They're not going to say, okay, now I should be the president because it's its own lane, it's its own path that you could have taken, you didn't, you did something else. So that's my feeling about what's going to happen. So I think that even if Putin has total success in Ukraine, which I think he won't, I don't think he would advance further. I don't think the support is there, and there can be no emergence of a greater competence like the Wagner Group. I mean, for me, and to talk about Chinese creativity, there are so many things that the Chinese government could be doing on many of its social problems that they're not. I'll give one example. There's a leader, Wang Huning, maybe his name is, who wrote a book, America Against Itself. It was circulating on the web. Very interesting book. He has his own interpretation of things.
well,
Yes.
Wang isn't he like a high official within the
Yeah, he's like the
country?
head of the Chinese political consulate, and he survived. And he, I'm sure, is aware of the one child policy and all the problems that it's having. And he only has one child. And all these Communist Party officials have one child. Something you could do tomorrow if you wanted to solve the one child problem in China is to say, to advance in the CCCP, you must have 3 children. If you did that, it would spark a sea change because all the elites have to become high fertility. And then my belief is basically that sometimes the middle classes and the lower classes will have to imitate elites. And so they will all increase their fertility in response. Nothing like that. There's other things you could do even with North Korea, if you wanted to cause problems for the US, I'm not going to say what they are, but I have thought about it. They could do all kinds of kooky things. Like they could ship, for instance, North Korean soldiers to Ukraine if they wanted to. They could put 100,000 North Korean soldiers into Ukraine, have them drive to Kharkiv, and try to basically take that. And they could subsidize that, or they could do which the U.S. had did, which the U.S. as a liberal democracy did with South Korean troops in Vietnam, which was part of our own warfighting efforts. That's why it lasted for so long, in part because we had hundreds of thousands of South Korean troops that we were paying, $400 to fight, and we were able to for a long time hold off against overwhelming opposition from Vietnam, from the Soviet Union, from China, simultaneously, and they just can't come up with clever things like that. Even when it comes to the semiconductor stuff, and so China has performed admirably. Look, it's a very well-educated society, so they've been able to catch up to the U.S. very quickly in semiconductors with all of the trade restrictions and so on. But they have not been able to catch up to the latest. Now I'd say they're what, 10 years behind? They're the latest of like 2013, 2014. But it's kind of a puzzle. Why do they need to compete on semiconductors at all? Like, can't they come up with something better? The best that you can do with many of these kinds of centrally planned regimes is to just copy what the capitalist systems are doing. This was a problem that Japan encountered with their own version. It's we're not supposed to call it authoritarian, but it had a central planning component in the form of MITI. MITI was the Office of Industrial and Trade Policy. And if you look at how MITI worked, how did MITI actually work? MITI did coordination within Japan itself, but they also did a ton of industrial espionage. And more or less what happened was once Japan had caught up to the US, basically, everything was about 80% of the productivity of the US. MIDI no longer seemed that successful. Once they had stolen as much as you can easily steal or borrow or learn, then it becomes very difficult for centrally planned systems to innovate because you need these weird geniuses and little teams working alone by themselves and to allow them to grow organically. And in some of these authoritarian capitalist systems, which is the more my optimistic case for China would be that they become something like that, and that becomes, I think, at least competitive with the U.S. Maybe it will still lose. They still have problems with this. And what they have with now Xi Jinping, where if any business becomes too big, it becomes threatening and thus gets shut down, there's no way that they'll be able to compete at scale in new industries. In old industries, when it relies on espionage and the fact that they have like a ton of smart people around, okay, they can do well. But I think when it comes to coming up with new things, they're going to just always be running into the same problems over and over. It's a fundamental problem of governance. That doesn't mean that they're doomed or that they won't have short-term success. Like I could see Putin winning, peace in Ukraine. I could see them settling. He takes some territory. He looks like a hero and goes home, and there's some parades, and then he retires, and he's looked at successfully. But that model has very limited capacity for evolution and the kind of tinkering that you need to be wealthy, I think, in the modern world and to achieve, some forms of even legitimacy from the people. So I think China is actually running into the same problem. So I'm actually very optimistic about the world stage from an American perspective. I would say, in distinction to Tyler Cohen, I think that if China was able to go back to the version of the authoritarian capitalism they had in, say, 2010, 2011, I don't know that the U.S. would be the best place in the world and things like that, that we would be able to be relatively number one forever. But as things stand now, I don't see why not. I could see, and I see this regardless of who's president. If Biden is president, if Trump is president, basically the U.S. will be an uncontested, maybe not hyperpower anymore. You can't project power over the whole world, but a superpower in the sense that we can project power over the whole world or outside of a few areas, and these other places just cannot.
Well,
And so that's my bottom line. Yeah,
but the Trump ideology is very different because I mean his idea is to kind of reduce commitment to alliances, and that's a course that no prior U.S. president has committed to. I mean, since basically Franklin Roosevelt. And I do think that if the U.S. wants to press its claims in other countries, it would have to be done within this alliance system. Now, I mean, obviously, I mean, there's also a lot of discontent. I mean, I argue with a German friend all the time because he's quite critical about the you could say U.S. imperial power and basically because I mean effectively I mean so in his view I mean Germany is like the biggest vassal state of the U.S., right? And
sure.
where basically I mean you have to let's say, provide the troops to be fighting in the Afghanistan war, which was in response to the American experience of 9/11. I mean, you've had like you know several maybe incidents already of terroristic attacks in Germany, and there never was any call to invade another country. And so in a way, yeah. So the you could say the vassals, the American colonies, if you wanted to use that language, um, certainly. I mean, there's some discontent within that system, but at the same time, I don't know. I mean, like, let's say, if I'm Ukraine or if I'm Taiwan, um, like my position would be, I want to have more America, right? Because they're the only ones that can protect me against basically the country that is invading me. And so therefore, I mean, I took, so of course, like during the Bush era, I mean, I was very stridently, like you could say, anti-US imperialist and stuff. I think that Iraq and Afghanistan were, basically imperial overstretches that should not have been done. Um, but I would say that the world that we have been moving into since, I would say, the mid 2010s, with the Russian aggressions and kind of the Chinese position on Taiwan and things like that. Um, and also what you're seeing in like what Iran is doing, right? I mean, basically pushing the proxies like Hamas, which caused like the bigger war with Israel. Then supporting Hezbollah, where right now there's fights between Israel and Hezbollah. Then the
I don't
Houthis are
know if
now.
it's clear that Iran supported Hamas. I don't know that's that's for sure an interpretation of events that's been given by Israel. I don't know if that's true. And I see also, I want to say Iran is another very fragile regime. It's something where that's interesting. They tried to come up with something a little bit different, like a really theocratic, platonic society that was going to do something very different, and I don't see that as a plausible contender to what the U.S. is doing. I don't see that as something that's exportable at all. And I see it as internally very fragile. People are fleeing the Iranian state. It's
Yeah,
impressive. I mean, I'm very impressed with how well Iran is doing when you consider that so many countries are sanctioning them and they're undergoing constant riots. Basically, every 7 years, there's some kind of upheaval regularly. So I don't see any of these kinds of things. I think that what's more threatening, my fundamental model is that to be globally destabilizing, you need to have an alternative model of governance that can catch on somewhere. Like it has to be universal and exportable, like Hegelian. Like I have this kind of notion that it has to be something that other people can be seduced by, that they can look at it and say, this is what we aspire to. Iran doesn't have it. Putin has it within Russia because of the historical memory, but that's a historical contingency. When Putin's gone, what does the regime have? I don't know that there's anything stable that he's built up beyond the memory that Putin lifted Russia up from a poor state.
yeah, but that was only up
Medvedev,
until
anyone who comes
2014,
after him,
right? It was
yeah, will
only
not
until
have that.
2014. Yeah.
Well, what? Say it again.
I mean, so when you're saying like Putin, rose up and improved the lives of the
No,
Russian
I mean
people
from 2000. No, Putin was the leader from 2000 in
from
Russia.
2000 to 2014. I think that
Right,
was
yes. And in
a
that
period of
period, Russia
improvement.
thrived and grew, and that builds up goodwill, but it's a temporary thing related to the leadership itself. It's not an alternative model of a regime. It's one person who, at that time, was, you could say, the right man for the job or appeared competent compared to the alternatives that were on hand, and a stabilizing force, but it's not an alternative regime. China 2010, I see that as an alternative regime. Xi Jinping, there's nothing that I think the world will look at and be seduced by there. That's my point. So you might have these contingencies like, okay, there's individual situations that could go wrong, but there's only one game in town right now, which I think is the US's model of, liberal, basically democratic, basically liberal, and with markets. You need to have markets, otherwise the system falls apart. So that's my interpretation of events. And so even if the U.S. left NATO, I wanted to do this thought experiment. Even if the U.S. left NATO, my prediction is that Russia would not advance a foot beyond Ukraine. And they would not do so because there's a nuclear power in NATO. As soon as you have one nuclear power in NATO, the risk of attacking a nuclear power is enormous. And so I see it as actually a very stable situation globally.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a big uh, question of what is going to happen. I mean, I do agree with the assessment of a lot of the Eastern European countries, like Poland and Lithuania and so forth. That they, that this concept of like NATO deterrence, I think, is going to be significantly diminished if the Western countries were all kind of dropping Ukraine like a hot potato, right? Where the
I don't
West,
agree with that. So I hear what you're saying. This is a perspective. It's a valid perspective. But my personal perspective is the opposite. Deterrence is backed by nuclear arms and the threat of using atomic weapons. And as long as NATO is an alliance, frankly, even if they were not necessarily an alliance, and NATO was abolished, I'm not sure. But if the U.S. left NATO, I'm still very sure. Because if the U.S. left NATO, let's say Trump gets power, U.S. leaves NATO, the global security situation might even improve in the sense that Russia feels that they can negotiate with the U.S. in good faith. That's possible. It's possible. It's certainly a possible outcome as long as there's one nuclear power in NATO. That to me is what the ultimate security of deterrence is. And as far as I can tell, NATO has one nuclear power that's not the U.S., so they should be fine. Because why would Russia invade a country that has an atomic weapon? It makes no sense. It invites disaster. They're too cautious to do that. If you look at how the Russian military operates, Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, these are all small countries, no nuclear deterrent. Russia has a history of ruling those areas. These dictatorships are cautious and not creative.
yeah, I mean, I hope that your interpretation is correct. I mean, but I'm also sympathetic to the scared Eastern Europeans. But I mean, just one more thing about like these authoritarian states and the fact that they do not have a model that they can spread, unlike the liberal democratic model. Broadly correct. However, I would say that it's enough for the authoritarian countries to be what we might call agents of chaos, right? Like that is to say, they don't really have to they don't have to offer a positive vision to a lot of other countries. I mean, in a sense, it's like if they're capable of steering enough problems within their like geographic neighborhood, um that squeezes out just enough internal legitimacy for them to sustain the rule, because they can still say, hey, look, we're still fighting this, American imperialists and their stooges, right? And therefore, you should support us. And I think it's not. I mean, you might say it's not a lot of legitimacy, but it seems to be enough. In this
Well,
game of
you're
power.
changing it a little bit. You're asking, will there still be dictatorships in a world full of democracies? Will there still be countries that try to do something different than what the US is doing? And I'm not, you could be, I think you're probably right that they will like use this kind of nationalism as a force of opposition, and they will use that to justify their reign. But the question for me, from a global perspective, is that seductive to other countries? And I don't think it's that attractive. I think there's not much there that other countries will look to. So you'll have the odd country out that doesn't want to follow the US, like in Africa or South America. You'll have Venezuela every now and then. But the Venezuelan models are actually part of the system. They help maintain legitimacy for the US. I actually think that agents of chaos can be very helpful in generating like global learning in the sense that, okay, we have Hugo Chavez. He was very popular, ultimately won against the US in terms of his internal political battles, secured a long and strong political machine that had lots of autonomy to do its own thing, and it collapsed. And it collapsed because it had bad ideas. Not competitive with the US. Ultimately, I think of the three things I listed, they abandoned markets. You can't abandon markets. You have some flexibility on the other things, but markets you really can't get rid of. So Afghanistan would be another one where Afghanistan, they didn't want to be part of the US system. They withdrew from it. Not seductive. And to some extent, to the extent that they're unattractive to their neighbors and to the rest of the world, I actually think that helps secure the US's legitimacy. Agents of Chaos can actually be very helpful to the US's global standing.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the largest nationality of the U.S. Mexico border crossers, are the Venezuelans, I think, at this
Yeah, right.
point.
There's not Mexican, right? But and that helps, I think, shore up legitimacy for the U.S. and other countries that are near Venezuela. Like Colombia, I would guess, has friendlier relations and is more aligned with the U.S. way of thinking today because of Venezuela than they would be otherwise. Because they see what the alternative looks like and the alternative looks bad.
But they did vote for I think a more left-leaning president, I want to say, more
They can be
recently.
left leaning. The U.S. is left leaning sometimes. You know, we had Bernie Sanders almost took power. It's that kind of fluctuation I see as like regular fluctuations within the system, within the global system itself. Um, what would be dangerous is if they have someone who's like left leaning and says, "I'm going to do something that's very different. I reject even the idea of democracy, or even the idea
Like
of
mass
markets, or even the
nationalization
idea."
of companies, things like that.
Yeah, something like that. If it worked, it would be dangerous. So if they nationalized, here would be something that's dangerous. They nationalize companies and it appears to work and become seductive to other countries. That's dangerous for the US's model. If it doesn't work, it actually supports the US. People look at it, they say that was what the other thing that was on sale and it was terrible. Okay, now we're going to do what the US is doing because that's the easy thing to do. That's the norm. That's tradition. What's very dangerous is something that appears to be working to the outside world. That's my perspective on it. As long as what they can do, what agents of chaos will do what they will, but if it appears to fail, then to the outside world, inside the system, it can actually be very secure because it appears to be succeeding. But if it appears to succeed to the outside world and the US is not more successful, clearly, that I think of as authoritarian capitalism in China 2010.
Yeah, I mean, but I do think that there's natural limits to authoritarian capitalism because, as you said, that's it was driven in large parts by, well, first of all, there was a demographic dividend, right? I mean, there was for a time there was a large number of like the rural to urban migrant workers, and they're selling the labor cheaply in those factories and produce products that are used in the world. I mean, that advantage kind of disappeared. And also, the second element is a copycat, as you mentioned, right? Where I mean,
Yeah, I don't mean to say that that's a true competitor to the US. I'm not saying that that's my endorsement, this is the way to go as a policy recommendation or anything, maybe the opposite. My point is that something like that can be seductive to the outside world. Other countries that are failing or have problems they may see, okay, we have the US choice and we have China 2010. And I want what they seem to have. Even if it's totally spurious. That's the point I'm making. Versus what they have under a dictatorship, it doesn't look successful to the outside world. And I actually do believe there are structural reasons why dictatorships will generally be less successful than authoritarian capitalism, and I'm more unsure. Like I think that basically liberal democracy will, win and blah 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 blah. But I think that the authoritarian capitalism does have features that may prove more dangerous, more robust, more competitive.
so you want to revive the Francis Fukuyama thesis, even though he himself, no longer, uh, you could say, advocates for it as strongly as he used to. Because I mean, if you look at Fukuyama's more recent writings, it's more about explaining Trumpism, explaining nationalism, the retreat of the liberal democratic order. I mean, so in the more recent iteration, it seems like that he goes more on the, I suppose, like Western pessimism slash civilization decline. I mean, he's definitely more favorable to that
Civilization could
standpoint.
decline. That's a separate issue from the seduction problem. I basically see the U.S. under Trump as liberal, democratic, and capitalist. I actually don't see Trump as a fundamental threat to it at all. I see him as, again, like the worst case scenario, which I don't think is what it is, as an agent as a test of the system. That, okay, you can elect somebody who has his own ideas that are like different from the mainstream, and he does his thing, and we do some experiments, some work, some maybe less successful, and then that's it. I think what's
So
actually
you
maybe
think
more
that he's not going to become a dictator? He's not going to change
I
the
think if he wins by
judiciary?
60%, he won't become dictator. I think if he wins a landslide majority, super majority victory, he will not be a dictator. It's not, first of all, it's not in his nature. You can see by the way he governs, right? I mean, dictators care a lot about policy details and things like that. I think fundamentally, he wants to be popular, he wants to be on TV, he wants to be well liked. These are all features of the liberal democratic system politician that they want too. I don't see him. I think that the interpretation that Fukuyama gives to Trump is wrong, and therefore, like, I think he's not, whether he's right or wrong, he could still be wrong. Like, I'll give some examples in which Fukuyama would be wrong. Let's say authoritarian capitalism is right. Like, when you have these AI systems, somehow that seems to work better, grok better with AI. And then he also believed that eugenics and more or less a different kind of human nature that you could engineer, that would be threatening to liberal democratic capitalism. For instance, you start to engineer people who are no longer envious, who don't feel the need to consume all the time. They're very happy with like where they are in life, and they contribute to the system, and they become more like that. That's just how they are. A fundamental change in human nature like that. China could do that. If they want to do these genetic experiments, they could do something like that and make a new type of person. And that new type of person who's okay would have a different regime type. And that regime type may just be more successful than liberal democratic capitalism. That could just be true. However, um, I guess I don't see that happening, and I don't see anything that's come on the horizon as a fundamental challenge to that kind of thing. Fukuyama lists three things. He lists fascism, he lists communism, and he lists capitalism. I mean, you could say monarchy too. And they all have some advantages and disadvantages. And basically, he argues that because of human nature, in the long run, liberal democratic capitalism will win. And I don't see Trump as a fascist, frankly. I don't see him as a communist. I don't see him as a monarch or of any kind. And so, to me, he actually does fit into the original paradigm that Fukuyama laid out. That's my interpretation. Is that fairly moderate in many ways. For instance, he's not challenging any of the entitlement systems. Why? Because he wants to be popular. Because he wants to have legitimacy within the system itself. Does he challenge capitalism? Not really. What does he want to do? Some revisions around trade deals. Does he challenge liberalism? Complicated, but really not. I mean, there's been not so many abridgments of, say, freedom of speech that you would expect from somebody who is making a legitimate challenge. So I'll give an example of something that I would say does challenge within the American system. Have you ever heard of integralism? It's a Catholic
No.
movement. These are people who believe that the church and state should be fused, and that we should basically have much more integration and less conflict between the church and the state. Clericals and priests being in governance roles and so on. That may not challenge markets, but it would clearly be a challenge to
The liberal
liberalism
democratic
for
order.
sure, possibly democracy. That exists within America. If some candidate, whoever said, I'm an integralist, I'm running on that, I'm going to win on that, and he won, that would be, I think, a challenge to the Fukuyama thesis. It would be like the Iran type of regime, something very different. And Trump is not running on that. I mean, he appointed some of those guys. Like, there was a guy, Adrian Vermeule at Harvard professor. I'm an integralist. That's what he says he is. And he got appointed to a committee on administrative law. Okay, that's one person. If he appointed 5,000 more people like that, then I would go. Then I would start to agree with Fukuyama's interpretation that his original ideas need some revision, and also Trump would need to be popular. This would need to be something that actually wins and is seductive in some way. So, okay, that's my
So
final take on the
so
matter.
I think, I mean, I might have agreed with you at some point on that thesis, but I mean, so this whole like the 2020 election shenanigans, right? I mean, so from the very first moment when he, did not recognize the official election results, and telling lie after lie, and being able to opt a few. I mean, not many. I mean, it was not a critical mass, but it was only like just a few. Like this one election observer in Michigan, and in like maybe in Georgia, like he tried to do that as well, but it failed. But it's like, and and sure, I mean, okay, in the important positions, right, like General Milley and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and
The
the
vice president
vice president. I mean, of course, and the Supreme Court justices. I mean, of course, okay, they
and his
sided
chief of staff, it's like,
right. They sided with the Constitution, but you still, I mean, I think even the attempt, right, this attempt to try to overthrow the election, um, and getting enough of his base. I mean, you might say, okay, it's just a few thousand idiots that are going to January 6th, but I mean, even that attempt, I think, does make me very concerned. Where if he steps into the White House again, is he then going to sit in his chair for 4 years, do whatever he wants to do, and then just gracefully leave office?
yeah. So that
I
that
don't.
so the scenario you bring up in which he doesn't try to leave after 4 years, that would be basically raise. It would raise the problem. If he said after 4 years in the next term from 2024 to 2028, and 2028 comes and he goes, no, we need to have abolish term limits or something. Okay, now I would have to change my mind. I don't
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
believe that that's correct. But if he did something like that, I would change my mind. I would be in your camp about liberals, about Trump, and what the meaning of him is. And I don't think he'll do that basically. And I think even if he did 2020, I think basically even if he was reelected, or he was able to get a majority of the electoral college to side with him, I think he would leave after 4 years. I think that's part of that's my interpretation of him. And he would go to Mar-a-Lago and he would have all the people saying, "You're great, you're a genius," and that's what he wants. And I think that would be the end. There's age. I mean, age is the discipline on a lot of these systems, is that people can't be in power when they're 81 years old. I think that doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's a stretch like that he would do it at that
that's
age.
Biden is exactly trying to make that point. I mean, the trouble is also that, like, he does act in a very, you know well, demented would be a very strong term, but in a very, uh you know cognitively impaired way, which I think is a little bit, is it no, just a little bit. I mean, I think it's very troublesome. I mean, especially for like a physically demanding, well, cognitively demanding job like the president. I mean, if you remember when like Bill Clinton or Obama, like they went into office with dark hair and they left with gray hair, right? Which I mean, I don't think it's just natural aging. I do think it has to do with the stress of the job. And so I mean, so you do have to have like very fit people that work these jobs, that work as a president, and Biden clearly doesn't have it in him. And it's not just the age. I mean, whatever the narratives that exist about whatever migration and inflation and whatever the topic is, that the polls are favorable towards Trump now. I mean, it was like he's up like 3-4 points, which is still
Yeah,
within
the very fact that we're
political error.
talking in this way about the polls and is he going to win the election again, this is just more evidence for the original Fukuyama thesis, which I think is most likely to be the correct one, which is that until they re-engineer human nature, this is going to be the kind of system that wins out. And I think that China, maybe they'll do that, but until they do that, this is going to be the system that seduces the most people and can build a legitimacy and a base. And I think that with Biden, with him, I agree, he's cognitively impaired, disabled, physically questionable. But the fact of the matter is that when you think about all of that, the system works remarkably well, right? The defense department, for instance, was operating autonomously. with no interactions with the White House for 7 or 8 days when the Secretary of Defense had to go in for surgery and didn't report to the president. And there were no issues. Nobody noticed anything. If it were not reported in the newspaper, it would not be a scandal. I
Well,
mean, think about that.
because the bureaucracy in the Pentagon
Yes,
is
because
doing the
this and, and
decisions.
and within the bureaucracy, every day, every bureaucrat goes to work. They expect to get their paycheck. The system appears to have some kind of legitimacy. There's no sense of chaos in their lives. There's no sense of chaos among the vast majority of American people. I would bet 98% of the American people don't know that for about 7 days, the Secretary of Defense and the whole defense establishment was operating autonomously. It would only have been an issue if a war happened at that particular week, which it wasn't. And this is with a president who's cognitively impaired, who has just severe problems, and the system is remarkably stable, even with someone like that at the top. You cannot maintain that in a dictatorship. So I think, again, all of this is evidence for the robustness of the system itself. The reductio ad absurdum would be somebody who cannot even make speeches or talk or do anything, and the system would still be working fine. That, to me, is evidence for the system's performance. That's exactly the kind of thing you want. It's a feature, not a bug.
Um, yeah, I mean that's a very optimistic ending. I mean, of course, I mean if you read newspaper too much, I think you get pessimistic about U.S. politics. You gave it a very positive framing, and I hope that this is how it is going to be, and that you know the U.S. election will go smoothly. I do think that the country would be slightly better off under Biden, in the sense that I think just like even outwardly paying deference to the norms of the office of the presidency. I think I do think this is quite important, and to have somebody that like a the TV star, reality TV star that doesn't care about it.
Well,
I
you
think.
just listed Biden violating norms in the sense that the Secretary of Defense was operating autonomously without anything, and it didn't bother. It was a minor inconvenience. So I don't know if that's as key as the fact that the whole system has legitimacy. That's kind of my take. So I think that I'm not going to comment on the 24 election, but I'm very optimistic overall. I think that the right result is going to come out, and I think
Well, I
regardless of
mean,
who's
your
elected,
take is basically it doesn't matter who wins, right? And the
it
system will
doesn't matter in
carry
the
on.
overall sense. There's going to be policy changes. I mean, I think that, for instance, if you think that climate change is a very important issue, there's one candidate who's taken it, far more serious than the other. On the other hand, if you're concerned about, immigration and the social solidarity thing, then you go to the opposite direction. I think there's particular issues that matter, and that balance is decided upon by the electorate. But I'm very sanguine, neutral, equivocal about the overall system, if that makes sense, from a sociological perspective.
Okay, okay, that's a very good note to end on. I think
Yeah, yeah, it's been good to
enjoyed
talk
the
to you, Larry.
important side. So, but thank you very much, Michael, for coming on here. Right.
Yeah, good to see you, and be